Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. April had just turned cold again when I got the call about the house. My childhood home in Millbridge, Vermont, had been sitting empty for 18 months since Dad passed, and the lawyer said it was time to either sell or commit to the property taxes. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The place held too many memories, and not all of them were the kind you want to revisit. But my apartment lease in Boston was ending, and I figured 2 weeks in Vermont wouldn't kill me. I could sort through decades of accumulated stuff, get the house ready for listing, and maybe find some closure. The drive up through New Hampshire felt longer than I remembered. The mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, still patched with dirty snow even though it was late March. Millbridge hadn't changed much. Population 3,200, one stoplight, 3 churches, and a general store that doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. The house looked smaller than it did in my memories. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the apple orchard behind the property had grown wild, branches tangled together like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Dad had stopped maintaining it after Mom died in 2009. I'd been away at college then, and when I came back for the funeral, the orchard was already starting its slow surrender to nature. Now it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind that doesn't end well. I'd hired a local kid, Andrew Brennan, to help me haul stuff to the dump. His mom had been friends with my mom back in high school, and he needed money for community college. He showed up on Monday morning in a pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape. We started in the attic, where Dad had stored everything he couldn't bear to throw away. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, my school projects from elementary school. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. The photo fell out of a water-damaged cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misc in Mom's handwriting. I almost missed it, would have if the corner hadn't caught the light just right. It was a Polaroid. The colors faded to that weird orange-yellow tint they get after a few decades. 5 teenage girls stood in a line, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were dressed in that unmistakable late 80s style, all big hair and acid-wash denim and neon windbreakers. I recognized Mom immediately, second from the left, her dark hair permed into oblivion. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. The photo had been taken in front of our orchard. I could see the neat rows of apple trees in the background before they'd gone wild. Someone had written on the white border at the bottom in blue pen, "Summer 1987, best friends forever." I flipped it over. On the back, in different handwriting, were 5 names: Diane, Julie, Mom's name, Vanessa, and Christine. I'd never seen this photo before. Mom had hardly any pictures from her teenage years, said she didn't like having her photo taken back then. But here she was, looking genuinely happy, surrounded by girls I'd never heard her mention. I showed it to Andrew, who was wrestling with a box of old National Geographic magazines. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like your mom had friends," he said. "That's the orchard, right?" Before it went crazy. I asked if he recognized any of the other girls, if their families still lived in town. He squinted at the photo, then pointed to the girl on the far right, a blonde with a prominent gap between her front teeth. That might be Christine Holloway. "There's still a Holloway family on Birch Road, but I don't know if they're related." He handed the photo back to me and went back to the magazines. Something about it bothered me, though, the way it had been tucked away in a random box, like someone had hidden it deliberately. That night after Andrew left, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Dad's old whiskey and stared at those 5 smiling faces. Mom's smile looked different than I remembered it, more open, less weighted down by whatever had made her so quiet in her later years. The next morning, I drove into town with the photo in my jacket pocket. The Millbridge Public Library was in the same building as the town hall, a brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Mrs. Galloway, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, looked up from her desk with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when I walked in. I told her I was doing some family history research, that I'd found an old photo of my mom and wanted to learn more about her friends. She got very still when I showed her the picture. Her finger traced over the faces, lingering on each one. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her it had been in a box in the attic. She handed it back quickly, like it had burned her. "Those girls," she said, then stopped. "Most of them moved away a long time ago. You know how it is with small towns? People leave." But there was something in the way she said it, something rehearsed, like she'd told this story before and had gotten good at making it sound casual. I pressed her, asked specifically about each name. Mrs. Galloway's jaw tightened. "Diane moved to California in 1988. Julie, I think she went to New York. Vanessa, maybe Florida. Christine stayed the longest, but she left too. Must have been 1989 or 1990. Every answer came out too quickly, too prepared. I asked if she had yearbooks from that era. Maybe I could find more information about them. She told me the yearbooks from those years had been damaged in a flood in the basement back in 2003. Most of them were thrown out. Convenient, I thought, but didn't say. I thanked her and left, but as I reached the door, she called out, "Your mother wouldn't want you digging into this." I turned around. "Into what?" She just shook her head and went back to her computer, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keyboard. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. The whole conversation felt wrong. People don't react like that to a simple question about old high school friends, not unless there's something to hide. I spent the rest of that day at the town hall, going through old newspaper archives on microfiche. The Millbridge Gazette was a weekly paper, mostly local sports and town council meetings, but I figured disappearances would make the news. I searched every issue from 1987 through 1992. Nothing. Not a single article about missing girls, runaways, or disappearances. There were obituaries, sure, but none for anyone matching those names or ages. What I did find was strange in its absence. There were gaps in the papers, issues that should have existed but didn't. July 1987 was missing. October 1988 had 3 consecutive weeks gone. Spring of 1989, another gap. I asked the clerk about it, a young guy who clearly didn't care much about his job. He said sometimes issues got damaged or lost over the years, it happens, but the pattern felt deliberate. Those weren't random gaps. I drove to the address Andrew had mentioned, the Holloway place on Birch Road. It was a small ranch house with peeling yellow paint and a yard full of cars in various states of disrepair. An older man answered the door, maybe in his 70s, with suspicious eyes and a Boston Red Sox cap pulled low. I introduced myself, said I was looking for information about Christine Holloway. His face changed instantly, not sad, but angry. "You a reporter?" he asked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. I told him no, that I was just trying to learn about my mom's old friends. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Christine ran away in 1989. Took off in the middle of the night, didn't leave a note, nothing. Police said she was 18, free to go where she wanted. End of story." But his voice cracked when he said her name. I asked if he'd ever heard from her after she left. He shook his head. "Not a word in 36 years. Her mother died thinking Christine hated us. You want to know the truth? The truth is this town let her disappear and nobody gave a damn." He started to close the door, then stopped. "Your uncle was the police chief back then, Harold Weaver. He told us Christine was a troubled girl, that she'd probably gone to find herself in some city somewhere. He said we should let it go, that she'd come back when she was ready. We believed him." The door shut in my face before I could respond. Uncle Harold. Mom's older brother, the one who died of a heart attack when I was 12. I barely remembered him. Just a stern man in a uniform who showed up at family holidays and didn't smile much. When I got back to the house, Andrew was loading broken furniture into his truck. I asked him if he knew anything about girls disappearing in the late 80s. He stopped mid-lift, an old chair suspended in his arms. "My mom mentioned something once," he said slowly. "She said there were some girls who left town back when she was in high school. But she got really weird when I asked about it, told me it was ancient history and I should focus on my own life." He set the chair down. "Why are you asking?" I showed him the photo again, explained what I'd learned. He looked uncomfortable. "Look, I need this job, but I don't want to get involved in something that's going to piss off the whole town. My family lives here." I told him I understood, that he didn't have to help me with this part. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. "There's an old storage unit out by Route 7. Police department used to keep evidence there before they built the new station. My uncle works maintenance for the facility. He said most of the old units haven't been touched in decades. If your uncle kept anything, it might still be there." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom, about how quiet she'd been my whole life, how she never talked about her childhood or her friends, how she'd sometimes stare out at the orchard with this look on her face, like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. I'd always assumed she was just sad about getting older, about how time changes things. But now I wondered if she'd been carrying something heavier. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the kitchen. The house made different sounds at night, creaks and groans I'd forgotten about. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the other girls. Diane, Julie, Vanessa. Nothing came up. No social media profiles, no obituaries, no marriage records, nothing. It was like they'd been erased. 5 girls in one photo, and 4 of them had vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. In a world where everyone exists online in some form, that kind of absence isn't accidental. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure these girls stayed gone, at least on paper. I thought about Uncle Harold, about his position of authority, about how easy it would be for a small-town police chief to make inconvenient questions disappear along with inconvenient people. The storage facility was a depressing row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that rents month to month and doesn't ask questions. Andrew's uncle, a heavy-set man named Don with nicotine-stained fingers, met me there on Wednesday morning. I'd told him I was looking for some of my uncle's old police files for a family history project. He didn't seem to care either way. "Unit 23, he said, handing me a key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "Haven't seen anyone access that one since before I started working here, and that was 2007. You find anything valuable? The department technically still owns it." The unit smelled like mildew and rust when I rolled up the door. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled with case numbers and dates. I started pulling them down, searching for anything from 1987 to 1990. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, petty theft reports, one domestic dispute case. Then, in a box marked MISC 1988-1989, I found a folder that made my hands go numb. It was labeled Informal Investigations in Uncle Harold's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings from other states, articles about unidentified remains found in rural areas. He'd circled certain details in red pen, details about age, gender, approximate time of death. There were also Polaroids, dozens of them, taken in the orchard behind my house. They showed disturbed earth, areas where the ground had clearly been dug up and refilled. Each photo had a date written on the back: July 1987, October 1988, April 1989, May 1989. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The dates matched the gaps in the newspaper archives. They matched the timeline of when the girls supposedly ran away. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and took pictures of everything in that folder. Every article, every photo, every note. There was a handwritten log too, Uncle Harold's daily notes. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were lines that made my stomach turn. Spoke with Holloway family again. They're accepting the runaway story. Diane's parents finally stopped calling. Convincing people these girls wanted to leave is easier than I thought. Small town prejudices work in my favor. And then, near the end of the log, one entry that broke something inside me. Spoke to my sister today. She knows, she's always known. But she won't say anything. Family protects family, even when it shouldn't. My mother had known. She'd known what happened to her friends, and she'd stayed silent for the rest of her life. carrying that weight alone because her brother was a murderer and she couldn't bring herself to turn him in. I drove straight to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rutland, 40 minutes away, with the folder on my passenger seat. I didn't trust anyone in Millbridge. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Carver, listened to everything without interrupting. When I showed her the photos and the log, her expression went from skeptical to grave. She made calls, and within hours, a forensics team was on its way to my property. They spent 3 days searching the orchard with ground-penetrating radar. They found 4 sets of remains buried in shallow graves exactly where Uncle Harold's photos indicated: Diane, Julie, Vanessa, and Christine. The 5th girl in the photo, my mother, had been the sole survivor, the one who got away because she was his sister. And even monsters sometimes have limits. The town exploded with the news. Some people were horrified, others were angry that I'd dug up the past. Mrs. Galloway refused to speak to anyone. Christine's father called me, sobbing, saying he'd waited 36 years to know what happened to his daughter, and thanking me for giving him that closure, even though it came with such terrible truth. I sold the house within a month, couldn't stand to be there anymore. The orchard was excavated completely, turned into a memorial garden for the victims. Before I left Vermont for good, I went back one last time and stood where that photo had been taken in 1987. 5 girls smiling at the camera, none of them knowing that 4 would be dead within 2 years, and the 5th would spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt and silence. I understood now why Mom had been so quiet, why she never wanted to talk about her past, why she'd look at the orchard with that haunted expression. She'd been looking at their graves, living above the evidence of her brother's crimes, knowing the truth but never speaking it, protecting a monster because he was family. I'll never know if she stayed silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, and maybe it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that those 4 girls finally got to go home to their families, even if it was 3 decades too late. I still have that photo, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I take it out and look at those 5 faces, all that youth and possibility, and I think about how one person's evil can ripple through generations, destroying not just the victims but everyone connected to them. The house sold to a family from Massachusetts who had no idea about its history. I didn't tell them. Maybe that makes me like my mother, keeping secrets to protect people from ugly truths. Or maybe some stories need to be buried along with the dead. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I'll never go back to Millbridge, and every time I see an apple orchard, I drive past it as fast as I can. People always ask why I became a journalist, and I usually give them some noble answer about truth and accountability. The real reason is simpler and darker than that. It started the day I came home to Cypress Bend, Louisiana to pack up my father's house after his funeral. Dad had been the town clerk for 40 years before retiring in 2014, and he'd kept everything. Every document, every file, every scrap of paper that passed through the municipal building ended up in our garage or attic. My older sister Kathleen refused to deal with it, said she had 3 kids and a husband to worry about, so the job fell to me. I'd just turned 36 the week before Dad died. No wife, no kids, just a decent job at a newspaper in Atlanta covering city council meetings and zoning disputes, the kind of stories that put people to sleep. I took a month's leave and drove the 9 hours back to the place I'd spent my whole childhood trying to escape. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. It sat on Magnolia Avenue, a street that used to be nice before the chemical plant laid off half the town in 2008. Dad's Toyota was still in the driveway, covered in that yellow pollen that coats everything in Louisiana during spring. It was a Saturday in May, humid as hell, and the cicadas were already screaming in the oak trees. I'd been dreading this for weeks, not just because of the grief, but because I knew what waited inside. Dad had been a hoarder of the bureaucratic kind. The living room was stacked with banker's boxes, the hallway lined with filing cabinets, the spare bedroom converted into what he called his archive. Mom had left him over it back when I was in college, said she couldn't live in a museum anymore. She'd remarried and moved to Florida, sent flowers to the funeral but didn't come. I couldn't blame her. The house smelled like old paper and the lemon cleaner Dad used obsessively, trying to keep the mold at bay. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, looking at the mountain of work ahead, and seriously considered just hiring an estate sale company to deal with all of it. I started in the garage because it seemed the least personal. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled in Dad's careful block letters. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Tax records, water bills from 1987, permits for shed construction, complaints about barking dogs, boring, mundane stuff that should have been thrown out decades ago. I worked methodically, creating piles for trash, recycling, and the maybe 5% worth keeping. By noon, I was covered in dust and spider webs, my back aching from bending over boxes. I'd filled 6 garbage bags and barely made a dent. That's when I found them, pushed way back in the corner behind a rusted lawnmower and some old paint cans. 4 boxes, sealed with packing tape that had gone brown and brittle with age. The labels were different from Dad's usual style, written in black marker, hurried and uneven. Flood Relief 93, do not open. The thing is, I remembered 1993. I was 7 years old when the flood hit. School got canceled for 2 weeks, and we had to stay with my aunt in Baton Rouge because water came up to our porch steps. It was the biggest disaster in Cypress Bend's history, the whole downtown underwater, people living in the high school gymnasium for months. But what struck me standing in that garage was the second part of the label. Why would Dad write, "Do not open," on relief documents? I pulled one of the boxes out, the cardboard soft with moisture damage despite being sealed. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to Dad's workbench and grabbed a utility knife from the pegboard. My journalist instincts were kicking in now, that familiar buzz I got when something didn't add up. I cut through the tape, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, but also something else, something chemical and wrong. Inside were files, hundreds of them, organized with the same precision Dad brought to everything. But these weren't relief documents. They were missing persons reports. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in just this one box. Each form was the official kind, the Louisiana State Police template with the seal at the top. But someone had stamped them all with red ink. Not processed. I pulled one out at random. A woman named Gloria Thibodeau, 41 years old, last seen at her home on Riverside Court on Wednesday, June 9, 1993. The report was filed by her sister on June 15th. There was a Polaroid photo paperclipped to the form, showing a smiling woman with dark curly hair standing in front of a small yellow house. I grabbed another file. James Ortega, 19, last seen leaving his job at the marina on the same date, June 9th. Another photo, a skinny kid with a work uniform and a shy smile. Then another, Carolyn Dufresne and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11. All last seen June 9th, 1993. All reported missing in the days after. All stamped, not processed. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the garage heat. June 9th, 1993 was the day the levee broke. I remembered because it was my grandmother's birthday, and we were supposed to have cake that evening, but never did because the sirens started going off around 3 in the afternoon. The Riverside neighborhood got hit first and worst, the water coming in so fast that people barely had time to get to their roofs. The news said it was 20 feet deep in some places. I grabbed my phone and started Googling, pulling up the old newspaper archives from the Cypress Bend Chronicle. The official death toll from the flood was listed as 7 people. 7. I had at least 30 missing persons reports in my hands from just one box, and there were 3 more boxes in that corner. I started pulling files faster, my hands getting that tremble you get when you're onto something big. Every single report had the same date, June 9th, 1993. Every single person was from Riverside, and every single form had that red stamp. Someone had deliberately not processed these reports. Someone had made these people disappear from the official record. I spent the next 4 hours going through all 4 boxes. By the time I finished, I'd counted 147 missing persons reports. 147 people who vanished the day of the flood, all from the same neighborhood, all officially erased. The files included everything you'd expect: detailed descriptions, last known locations, family contacts, even some personal effects that had been turned in. A wallet, a set of house keys, a child's stuffed rabbit, water-stained and falling apart. Someone had taken these reports seriously enough to collect evidence, but then buried them. I found something else too, tucked into the bottom of the last box. A manila envelope marked, "Engineering Survey, Confidential." Inside were blueprints of the levee system, covered in notations and calculations in different handwriting. Yellow sticky notes were attached to several pages, and one note made my stomach turn. It was dated June 8, 1993, the day before the flood. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Charges placed as requested. Primary breach point north sector will direct flow to Riverside. Detonation window 2:04 p.m. Wednesday. God forgive us. I sat down hard on Dad's workbench stool, my legs suddenly unreliable. Someone had blown the levee on purpose. They deliberately flooded Riverside, and my father had known about it. The evidence was in his garage, hidden for 31 years. I thought about Dad's last few months, how he'd gotten quiet and withdrawn, how he'd stopped going to church even though he'd been an usher for 20 years, how he'd called me 3 times in the weeks before his heart attack, leaving rambling messages about needing to tell me something important. But I'd been busy with a story deadline and kept saying I'd call him back later. I never did. Now he was gone, and I was holding proof of mass murder. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything about Riverside neighborhood. What I found made everything worse. After the flood, the land had been declared unusable, too damaged to rebuild. The entire neighborhood, 43 acres, had been sold to a development company for next to nothing. That company was owned by the Prudhomme family. Everyone in Cypress Bend knew the Prudhommes. They owned half the parish, had for generations. Sugar cane plantations, timber operations, commercial real estate. The family estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, a white mansion with columns that had been there since before the Civil War. In 1993, the patriarch was Jean-Paul Prudhomme, and according to the property records I was pulling up, his holdings had been directly upstream from Riverside. If the levee had broken naturally where it was supposed to, the water would have flooded his processing plant and 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land. But by breaching it at the north sector instead, the water got diverted away from his property and straight into Riverside, a poor neighborhood where most people rented, where nobody had the money or connections to fight back. I found a photo from the Chronicle dated June 11, 1993, showing Jean-Paul touring the flood damage with the governor. He looked concerned in that practiced way rich people do, wearing rubber boots that probably cost more than most people's rent. The caption mentioned his generous donation to the relief fund. Blood money. I couldn't stay in that garage anymore. I loaded all 4 boxes into my car, then went back for the engineering documents. It was almost 7 in the evening, the sun setting orange and angry through the humidity. I sat in my car with the air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart move would be to call the FBI, hand everything over, let the professionals handle it. But I'd been a journalist long enough to know how these things went. The Prudhommes had money, real money, the kind that bought lawyers and politicians and made evidence disappear. Jean-Paul was dead now, had been for a decade, but his son Olivier ran the family business and sat on every important board in the parish. One phone call from him and this whole thing could get buried again, just like Dad had buried it. No, I needed to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then go public in a way that couldn't be ignored. I drove to the one place in Cypress Bend I knew would have the records I needed, the parish courthouse. The building was closed, but I'd grown up in this town and knew things tourists didn't. The records room had a separate entrance in the back, and the night security guard was Billy Fontaine, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school. I knocked on the maintenance door until he opened it, looking annoyed until he recognized me. We talked for 10 minutes about Dad's funeral, about his own father's diabetes, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. Then I told him I needed to look at some property records for a story I was writing, and he let me in without asking questions. Small town courtesy. the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on who's watching. I spent 3 hours in that records room, photographing everything: deeds, tax assessments, water management reports, environmental surveys. I found the original engineering specifications for the levee, which showed the north sector was actually reinforced concrete, the strongest point in the entire system. For it to fail there naturally would have been nearly impossible. I found insurance claims too, dozens of them, all denied because flood insurance didn't cover acts of God back then. People lost everything and got nothing. The last thing I found was a memo dated June 15, 1993, from the Parish Emergency Management Office to all local law enforcement. It ordered them to halt processing of any missing persons reports from Riverside until further notice, citing the need to avoid premature panic and allow time for thorough rescue operations. The memo was signed by the emergency coordinator, a man named Frank Boudreau, but at the bottom was a handwritten note, per prud'homme request. That's when I understood what Dad had done. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been the one person who'd refused to destroy the evidence. Everyone else had followed orders, but Dad had kept those reports, hidden them, preserved them for 31 years until someone could do something about it. He'd tried to tell me before he died, and I'd been too busy to listen. I left the courthouse at midnight with my phone full of documentation and a plan forming in my head. I couldn't trust the local police. Half of them probably owed their jobs to Prud'homme donations. But I had friends at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and I had enough evidence to make this national news. I drove back to Dad's house, uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services, and sent encrypted files to 2 journalist colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I finally allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I'd discovered, and I cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. The story broke 6 days later. I'd spent that time tracking down survivors, people who'd lost family members in Riverside and never got answers. Most had moved away, scattered across Louisiana and beyond, but they all remembered. They remembered filing reports that went nowhere, remembered being told their loved ones probably just left town, remembered the way people stopped asking questions when the Prud'homme name came up. I interviewed 23 people, recorded every conversation, documented every detail. When the Times-Picayune published the first article, it included photographs of the missing persons reports, scans of the engineering documents, and testimony from the survivors. The headline read, "Cypress Bend Flood of '93. New evidence suggests deliberate levee breach killed over 140. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation, and the Louisiana Attorney General announced a special task force. Olivier Prud'homme released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory, but his lawyers couldn't explain away the documents. The physical evidence was too damning, too specific, too real. 3 months later, they found the bodies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old Riverside neighborhood, which was now a shopping center and parking lot, revealed multiple unmarked burial sites. The excavation took weeks, but they eventually recovered remains of 68 people, including children. DNA testing confirmed their identities matched names from Dad's missing persons reports. The medical examiner determined most had drowned, but some showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been caught in the initial blast when the levee was breached. Olivier Prud'homme was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He maintained his father had acted alone, but financial records showed he'd paid off 3 parish officials as recently as 2023 to keep the Riverside files sealed. Frank Boudreau, the old emergency coordinator, confessed in exchange for immunity. He confirmed Jean-Paul Prud'homme had ordered the levee breach and paid the demolition crew $500,000 in cash. The crew members were dead now, conveniently all of natural causes over the past decade. But Boudreau's testimony was enough. The trial starts next month, and I'll be there to cover every minute of it. I still live in Cypress Bend now. Quit my job in Atlanta and took a position at the Chronicle, the same paper that once published puff pieces about Jean Paul's charity work. They made me investigative editor, gave me full freedom to dig into whatever stories the town tried to bury. Kathleen speaks to me again, said she's proud of what I did, even if it means the family name is complicated around here. Some people treat me like a hero, others won't make eye contact at the grocery store. The Prudhommes still have friends, still have money, still have power, but they don't have silence anymore. Dad's house sold last month, and I used part of the money to help fund a memorial for the Riverside victims. It's a simple granite wall with all 147 names engraved, located on the only piece of the old neighborhood that wasn't developed, a small park by the river. At the dedication ceremony, survivors came from all over the country. They touched the names, cried, finally had a place to grieve. I think about Dad standing in that garage looking at those boxes year after year, carrying the weight of what he knew and couldn't fix. He did what he could with what he had, and in the end, that was enough. The truth came out, even if it took 31 years and his death to make it happen. Sometimes justice is just someone refusing to let the world forget. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person posting something like this online, but I need to get it out somewhere because talking about it in person makes me feel sick all over again. My wife Claire and I got married in June 2014, right after I finished my teaching degree. We were broke as hell, living off her salary as a dental hygienist while I scrambled for substitute teaching gigs around the county. When we found that rental house on the edge of Fairmont, Pennsylvania, it felt like we'd won the lottery. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a little backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, all for $800 a month. The landlord, this guy named Vincent Marsh, seemed normal enough when we met him at the property. Mid-50s, thinning gray hair, wore these thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He smiled a lot, maybe too much, but we figured he was just eager to rent the place after it sat empty for 3 months. We moved in on a Saturday in late July, and I remember thinking the house had good bones despite the outdated wallpaper and the weird, musty smell in the hallway closet. Claire was already planning which walls we'd repaint, talking about hanging curtains in the bedroom to block out the streetlight that shone directly through our window at night. That first week felt like playing house, you know. We'd order pizza and eat it on the floor, because our furniture hadn't arrived yet, making plans about the life we were going to build there. Vincent stopped by twice that week, once to fix a leaky faucet and another time to check the furnace before winter, he said. Both times he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about our schedules, when we'd be home, whether we were light sleepers. Claire mentioned later that she thought it was weird how he kept glancing toward our bedroom door, but I brushed it off. Landlords are nosy, right? They want to make sure you're not trashing their property. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handed me his business card, or how he wrote his personal cell number on the back in pen that smudged across the paper like he'd been sweating. It was Claire who noticed the first hole. We'd been living there almost 3 weeks when she decided to rearrange the bedroom furniture. She wanted the bed against the far wall instead of under the window, thought it would help us sleep better without that streetlight blazing into our faces every night. When we pushed the dresser away from the corner, there it was, right at eye level if you were standing in the hallway outside. A perfectly round hole, maybe half an inch across, drilled straight through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and when I put my eye up to it, I could see directly into our bedroom, a clear view of where our bed had been positioned for the past 3 weeks. My throat got tight. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a minute, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant hung something heavy. Maybe there was some electrical work done, but the hole was too clean, too purposeful, and it was aimed at exactly the right height and angle. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking the other walls, moving furniture, pulling down the few pictures we'd hung. We found 2 more in the bedroom alone. One behind the nightstand on Claire's side, another near the closet that gave a perfect view of where she changed clothes every morning before work. The panic really set in when we checked the bathroom. I had to move the towel rack to find it, but there it was. Another hole drilled through the wall that separated the bathroom from the utility closet in the hallway. This one was positioned to see directly into the shower. Claire started crying, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, and I felt this rage building in my chest that made my vision blur at the edges. We'd been showering there for 3 weeks. We'd been sleeping there, changing there, doing everything married people do in the privacy of their own home. I wanted to punch something, wanted to drive straight to Vincent's house and drag him out by his collar, but Claire begged me to call the police first. She was shaking so badly I had to dial the number for her. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we'd found, but the words came out jumbled and probably didn't make much sense. The dispatcher kept asking if we were in immediate danger, if someone was in the house right now, and I kept saying no, but yes. Someone had been watching us. Someone had violated us in a way I couldn't even articulate. They said they'd send an officer over within the hour. That hour felt like a decade. While we waited, I couldn't just sit there. I went into the hallway closet, the one with that musty smell we'd never bothered investigating, and started pulling out the boxes of Christmas decorations and old paint cans the previous tenant had left behind. At the back of the closet, behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall, I found the access panel to the crawl space above the first floor. The panel wasn't screwed in like it should have been. It just lifted right off. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, boosted myself up, and shone the flashlight into the darkness above. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. There were wires everywhere, thin black cables running along the ceiling joists like veins, all converging toward a central point above our bedroom. I followed them with the flashlight beam and found a small metal box bolted to a beam, about the size of a lunchbox, with more wires feeding into it from different directions. Some of the cables disappeared into holes drilled down through the ceiling, positioned exactly where we'd found the holes in the walls below. I'm not an electrician, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't original wiring. This was new, maybe a few months old based on how clean the plastic coating looked. Claire called up to me asking what I'd found, but I couldn't form words. I just climbed down and showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone. Her face went completely white. The officer who showed up was young, couldn't have been more than a year or two out of the academy. His name was Officer Reynolds, and he had this uncomfortable expression like he'd been expecting a noise complaint, not whatever mess we were describing. He looked at the holes, took some pictures with the department camera, then asked if he could see the crawl space. I took him up there, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to deeply concerned as he swept his own flashlight across the wiring. He made a phone call, spoke in that clipped cop voice they use on radios, and within 20 minutes, 2 detectives showed up. Detective Brenner was older, maybe 50, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. His partner was a woman named Detective Huang, sharp and focused, already pulling on latex gloves before she'd even climbed into the crawl space. They spent 45 minutes up there talking in low voices we couldn't quite hear, occasionally asking us questions through the opening. Had we touched anything? Had we noticed anyone unusual around the property? Did the landlord have keys? That last question hit different. Of course he had keys. He was the landlord. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and we'd never know. Detective Huang came down from the crawl space holding an evidence bag with the metal box inside. She set it on our kitchen table like it was radioactive, and Brenner explained what they'd found. The box was a wireless transmitter, the kind you could buy online for a few $100s, designed to send video signals to a remote receiver. The wires fed into tiny cameras, pinhole style, fitted into the holes we'd discovered. 4 cameras total, they'd counted. Bedroom, bathroom, and 2 in the living room we hadn't even found yet because they were hidden behind air vents. Huang asked if we'd given permission for any surveillance equipment, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Then Brenner asked for Vincent's contact information, and I handed over that business card with his smudged cell number. They tried calling him right there in front of us. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Brenner left a message, professional and calm, asking Vincent to call back regarding an urgent matter at the property. We all knew he wouldn't call back. You could see it in the way the detectives looked at each other. That silent communication cops develop after working together long enough. Huang asked if we had anywhere else to stay tonight. The way she said it, like it wasn't really a question, made it clear we shouldn't be sleeping there. We ended up at Claire's parents' house in Harrisburg, about an hour away. Her mom kept trying to make tea and asking if we were hungry, doing that thing parents do when they don't know how to fix something, so they offer food instead. Claire's dad just sat there looking furious, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal box, those wires, Vincent's huge eyes behind those thick glasses staring at footage of us in our most private moments. How long had he been watching? Had he watched us on our wedding night when we came home late and exhausted? Had he seen every fight, every intimate moment, every time we walked around in our underwear thinking we were alone? The violation of it felt like something crawling under my skin. The next morning, Brenner called my cell. They'd gone to the address listed on Vincent's landlord registration. The house was empty. Not just empty like he wasn't home, but empty like he'd cleared out in a hurry. Neighbors said they'd seen him loading boxes into a van around midnight, just hours after we'd called the police. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail now, probably turned off or destroyed. They'd put out a bulletin for his vehicle, a white cargo van with Pennsylvania plates, but Brenner didn't sound optimistic about finding him quickly. What happened next is the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. 3 days after Vincent disappeared, Detective Huang called and asked if we could come down to the station. When we got there, she led us into a conference room where Brenner had spread out papers and photographs across the table, like some kind of horrifying puzzle. They'd started digging into Vincent's background, pulling property records and cross-referencing rental listings. Turns out our house wasn't the only one. Vincent owned 6 rental properties scattered across 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, all advertised as affordable housing for young couples and single women. The detectives had obtained warrants and searched every single property. 5 of them had the same setup. Holes in the walls, cameras hidden in bedrooms and bathrooms, wiring running to transmitters in crawl spaces or attics. One house in Altoona had 8 cameras installed. 8. Huang showed us a spreadsheet she'd created, listing the current and former tenants they'd identified going back 3 years. 22 people had lived in those houses during that time. 22 people who had no idea they'd been watched, recorded, violated in their own homes. Some had already moved away, gotten married, started families. The detectives were in the process of contacting everyone, and I could see the weight of it on Huang's face, knowing she'd have to make those phone calls and destroy people's sense of safety and privacy all over again. Brenner pulled out another folder, this one thicker, and explained that they'd executed a warrant for Vincent's financial records. He'd been paying for cloud storage, massive amounts of it, through an offshore service that specialized in, let's say, discretionary data hosting. The kind of service that doesn't ask questions and doesn't cooperate easily with law enforcement. They were working with federal investigators now because the scope had expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit was involved, trying to trace where the footage had been uploaded and whether Vincent had distributed or sold any of it. That word "sold" hit me like a hammer. The idea that strangers might have paid money to watch me and Claire in our bedroom, that our most private moments might be saved on some server in another country, being traded around by people whose faces we'd never see. It made me want to vomit right there on the conference room table. Claire started crying again, and Huang pushed a box of tissues across the table with the kind of practiced gentleness that told me she'd done this too many times before. Brenner said they'd keep us updated, that they were doing everything possible to track Vincent down and secure any footage that might exist. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The internet is vast. Data can be copied, backed up, hidden in places even experts struggle to find. We never went back to that house. Claire couldn't even drive past the street without having a panic attack, and honestly, neither could I. We broke the lease, which legally we probably didn't have to do given the circumstances, but I didn't want to spend another second tied to anything Vincent owned. We moved into a cramped apartment in Harrisburg, closer to Claire's work and her family. A place with new construction and walls we could verify were solid all the way through. I became obsessive about checking for cameras. Every hotel room, every Airbnb, even bathrooms at friends' houses, I'd find myself scanning the walls and ceilings, looking for tiny holes or unusual objects positioned at weird angles. Claire started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She'd come home from sessions exhausted and raw, and some nights she'd just sit on the couch staring at nothing while I made dinner neither of us wanted to eat. Our marriage took a hit. Not because we blamed each other, but because the invasion had poisoned something fundamental between us. Intimacy became complicated, loaded with the knowledge that someone had stolen it from us, and we could never get it back. We got through it, slowly, with a lot of therapy and patience and honest conversations that hurt like open wounds. But it changed us. You don't come back from something like that completely whole. Vincent Marsh was arrested 4 months later at a border crossing in Texas, trying to get into Mexico with fake identification. The cargo van was full of hard drives and equipment. Turns out he'd been planning this for a while, had money stashed in accounts under different names, probably anticipating the day someone would discover what he'd been doing. The trial took 2 years, dragged out by legal motions and evidence processing. The FBI recovered footage from multiple cloud accounts, thousands of hours of recordings spanning back to 2011. He'd been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. 22 victims became 43 as more people came forward after seeing news coverage. Some of the footage had been sold on dark web forums, distributed to networks of people who paid subscription fees to watch real surveillance of unsuspecting people. Vincent pleaded guilty eventually, probably because his lawyers knew a jury would bury him. He got 38 years in federal prison, no parole. He'll be 90 when he's eligible for release, if he lives that long. Huang called me the day the sentence came down. She said it was one of the longest sentences she'd seen for this type of crime, that the judge had been visibly disgusted during sentencing. It should have felt like victory, like justice, but mostly I just felt tired. Claire and I were in our new house by then, a place we'd bought instead of rented, where we'd personally inspected every inch before signing the papers. We're okay now, or as okay as you can be after something like this. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch Claire staring at a wall with that distant look, and I know she's back there, in that bedroom on the edge of Fairmont, realizing someone was watching. The violation doesn't fade. You just learn to carry it differently. And every time I hear about someone finding a great deal on a rental, I want to tell them to check the walls first. Check everything. Because privacy is an illusion, and trust is a luxury not everyone deserves. Teaching 5th grade in Dalton felt like the kind of quiet life I needed after the chaos of my divorce 2 years prior. The town had maybe 8,000 people, tucked between the mountains in northwest Georgia, where everyone knew everyone and Sunday service at Covenant Fellowship wasn't optional if you wanted to fit in. I started attending because my principal, Mr. Warren, mentioned it during my interview, saying the church was the heart of the community and most of the school staff were members. Within my first month, I'd been welcomed with casseroles, invitations to potlucks, and warm smiles from people who seemed genuinely kind. The church itself was this beautiful old building with white columns and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews during morning service. Everything felt safe, normal, like I'd finally found a place where I could rebuild my life and focus on my students without the drama I'd left behind in Savannah. But sometime around mid-October, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. After service one Sunday, I saw 3 of my colleagues, including Beth Sullivan, who taught 3rd grade, huddled in the parking lot with Deacon Phillips and 2 other church elders I didn't know well. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when I waved at Beth, she looked almost startled before giving me this tight, forced smile and turning back to the group. The conversation stopped completely when I walked past them to my car. Then there was the Wednesday evening Bible study I'd started attending, where certain members would exchange these meaningful glances, whenever someone mentioned the community committee, which I'd been told was just a charity organization that helped struggling families in the area. I'd asked about volunteering once, and the room had gone uncomfortably silent before someone changed the subject. People were friendly enough to my face, but I was starting to feel like there was this whole other layer to the church that I wasn't part of, like everyone was in on something I didn't understand. The warmth I'd initially felt was beginning to seem performative, calculated even, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. The thing that really kicked everything into gear happened on a Monday morning in late October. I arrived at school to find out that Beth Sullivan had resigned effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no goodbye, nothing. Her classroom was already being packed up by the janitor, and when I asked Mr. Warren about it, he got this weird look on his face and said Beth had personal matters to attend to and had moved out of state to be with family. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. I'd had coffee with Beth just 3 days earlier, on Friday afternoon, and she'd been excitedly planning her classroom Halloween party. She'd shown me the decorations she'd bought, talked about how her kids were going to love the costume contest, and mentioned she was hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year for the first time. She didn't seem like someone about to uproot her entire life. I tried calling her cell phone during my lunch break, and it went straight to a disconnected number message. Her Facebook page was gone. It was like she'd been erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the week. During Wednesday evening service, I noticed Beth's usual seat in the fourth pew was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, like the congregation had just moved on without missing a beat. After the service ended, I approached Deacon Phillips and asked if he knew how to reach Beth, saying I wanted to send her a card or something. The way his expression shifted made my chest tighten. He put his hand on my shoulder, this gesture that probably looked comforting to anyone watching, but his grip was firm enough to feel like a warning. He told me that Beth had made her choice, and it was best to respect her privacy and focus on my own responsibilities here. The way he emphasized "here" felt deliberate, pointed. When I mentioned that her phone was disconnected, he just smiled and said sometimes people need to make clean breaks, then walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the conversation and realizing he'd never actually answered my question about how to contact her. Nobody had. The next Sunday I decided to do something probably stupid, but I couldn't help myself. After service, I lingered near the fellowship hall where coffee and donuts were set up, and I started casually asking other members if they'd heard from Beth. The reactions were all variations of the same theme: awkward pauses, quick subject changes, or these rehearsed-sounding responses about respecting her decision and moving forward. But it was Margaret Torres, the church secretary who'd always been chatty with me, who really confirmed my suspicions. When I asked her, she actually glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that I should stop asking questions about Beth. Her exact words were, "Some people aren't cut out for the level of commitment this community requires, and it's better for everyone when they realize that sooner rather than later." When I pressed her on what she meant by commitment, she straightened up, plastered on a smile, and said she had to help clean up, practically speed walking away from me. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling genuinely unsettled. What kind of church talks about commitment like it's some binding contract you can't get out of? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching how people interacted. The community committee met every other Friday evening in the church basement, and I'd see the same group of maybe 20 people heading down there. Always the same faces, including Mr. Warren, Deacon Phillips, and several other teachers from school. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, and when they came back up, they always looked serious, purposeful, like they'd just attended some important business meeting, rather than a charity planning session. One Friday in early November, I made an excuse about leaving my sweater in the sanctuary and doubled back after everyone thought I'd left. I could hear voices coming from the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. I stood there for a minute, listening, and I could make out someone talking about maintaining the structure and ensuring compliance, which seemed like really weird language for organizing food drives or whatever they were supposedly doing. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and I had to scramble back to my car, my heart absolutely pounding. feeling like a kid who'd almost gotten caught doing something wrong. What really sent me down the rabbit hole was finding Beth's lesson planner in the supply closet at school. I'd gone in looking for construction paper for my class, and there it was, shoved behind some boxes on the top shelf like someone had hidden it quickly. Her handwriting was all over it, plans sketched out through December, parent conference notes, everything. On the inside cover, she'd written her sister's phone number in California with a note that said, "Emily, emergency contact." I took a photo of the number with my phone and called it that evening from my apartment. A woman answered, and when I explained who I was and asked about Beth, there was this long, painful silence before she said Beth hadn't contacted any family members. Emily's voice cracked when she told me she'd filed a missing person report 2 weeks ago, but the police in Dalton had told her that Beth had resigned from her job voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play, so they weren't investigating. Emily said she'd driven down from California to look for her sister, had gone to the church and spoken with Deacon Phillips, and he'd told her the same story about Beth moving away for personal reasons. But Emily knew her sister, knew Beth would never just vanish without telling family, and she'd left Dalton feeling like everyone was lying to her but having no proof of anything. After I hung up with Emily, I sat on my couch for probably an hour just trying to process what this meant. A woman had vanished, her own sister couldn't find her, and an entire church congregation was apparently okay with pretending everything was normal. I thought about going to the police myself, but what would I even say? That people at my church were acting weird and my colleague had quit her job? There was nothing concrete, nothing illegal that I could point to. The next day at school, I noticed Mr. Warren watching me more closely than usual during the staff meeting. When it ended, he asked me to stay behind, and once everyone else had filed out, he closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk in this casual way that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. He asked how I was adjusting to the community, if I felt welcomed at church, and then he said he'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about Beth Sullivan. The way he looked at me when he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to play it off, said I was just concerned about a friend, but he cut me off and said that sometimes curiosity can make a person's life more complicated than it needs to be. Those were his exact words. Then he smiled, told me he was sure I understood, and suggested I focus on being a positive presence for my students, rather than dwelling on people who'd chosen to move on. That conversation scared me more than anything else had up to that point, because it meant they knew I was digging, and they were watching me. I decided to back off for a while, attend church like normal, smile and nod, and pretend everything was fine. But I also started documenting things, writing down dates and names and strange interactions in a notebook I kept hidden in my apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I got a knock on my door around 8 at night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Deacon Phillips standing there with 2 other men from the community committee, both wearing suits despite the late hour. My entire body went cold. I considered not answering, but my car was parked right outside, and all the lights in my apartment were on, so they obviously knew I was home. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, Deacon Phillips gave me that same unsettling smile and said they'd like to talk to me about joining the community committee. He said I'd shown such dedication to the church and the school that they felt I'd be a perfect addition to their organization. The way he phrased it didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like an inevitability. I told them through the gap in the door that I appreciated the offer, but I was still fairly new to the area and wanted to settle in more before taking on additional commitments. One of the other men, someone whose name I didn't know but who I'd seen at every service, stepped closer and said that membership in the committee wasn't really optional for people who were serious about being part of the Covenant Fellowship community. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining simple math to a child. Deacon Phillips added that everyone at the church who held any position of influence or respect was part of the committee, and that my principal, Mr. Warren, had specifically recommended me. He said they had a special initiation meeting this coming Friday, and they'd expect to see me there at 7 in the evening. When I started to protest, to say I needed time to think about it, The third man finally spoke up and mentioned how unfortunate it had been that Beth Sullivan hadn't understood the importance of commitment, how she'd made things difficult for herself by trying to walk away. The implicit threat in his words was crystal clear. I managed to tell them I'd think about it and close the door, then immediately pushed my couch against it and spent the rest of the night planning what the hell I was going to do. I knew I couldn't just refuse and stay in Dalton. Whatever this community committee actually was, they clearly had enough influence to make people disappear without consequences, and the local police were either part of it or too intimidated to investigate. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called in sick to school, went to the bank and withdrew everything from my checking account, and started packing only what would fit in my car. I didn't give notice to my landlord, didn't tell anyone at school I was leaving, didn't post anything on social media. I loaded up my sedan that afternoon while most people were still at work, threw my notebook with all my documentation into my bag, and planned to leave Friday morning before dawn, hours before that 7 o'clock meeting they expected me at. But Thursday night, around 11, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to my second-floor apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath in the darkness, watching the shadow of feet visible under the door gap. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard a piece of paper slide under my door. When the footsteps finally retreated, I waited another 10 minutes before turning on a light and picking up the paper. It was a printed schedule for tomorrow's initiation ceremony, with my name already typed at the top, along with a note that said, "We look forward to welcoming you into our family. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you won't want to miss." I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, I grabbed my bags, left my apartment key on the counter, and walked as quietly as I could down to my car. The street was completely empty and dark except for one streetlight flickering at the end of the block. I threw everything in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as the engine started, I saw headlights turn onto my street from the far end. A dark SUV moving slowly, like it was patrolling. I didn't wait to see if it was coming for me. I pulled out and drove in the opposite direction, taking back roads out of town, constantly checking my rearview mirror for anyone following me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop except for gas, and ended up at my cousin's place in North Carolina by mid-morning. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, barely leaving her apartment, jumping at every unexpected sound. I finally worked up the courage to call Emily, Beth's sister, and told her everything that had happened to me. She broke down crying and said she'd suspected something like this but had no way to prove it. Together, we contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte, and I turned over my notebook with all the documentation. An agent took my statement and said they'd look into it, but warned me that without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He did say that Dalton had come up before in relation to some financial irregularities involving a church organization, and my information might help build a case, but it could take months or even years. He strongly advised me not to return to Dalton under any circumstances. It's been 8 months since I left, and I'm teaching at a different school now in a different state, using my maiden name from before my marriage. I checked the news from Dalton compulsively, looking for any updates, but there's been nothing about the church or the community committee. Beth Sullivan is still listed as a missing person with no new developments. Emily texts me sometimes, and we both hold on to this thin hope that maybe the investigation will eventually uncover something. But I'm not holding my breath. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how many people might still be trapped in that system, too afraid to leave, or too deep into whatever that organization actually does. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that church basement, where the locked door opens and I see what they were really doing down there, but I always wake up before finding out. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder to expose them, but then I remember the look in Deacon Phillips's eyes when he stood at my door, and I know I made the only choice I could. I'm safe now. I have a new job and a new start, but I'll never really feel settled again. I'll always be looking around corners, always wondering if someone from Covenant Fellowship might track me down, because I'm the one who got away and talked to the FBI. That's what they took from me, even though I escaped. They took my ability to ever feel completely safe again, to trust a community, to believe that friendly faces in a small town church are actually what they appear to be. And somewhere in Dalton, Georgia, they're still meeting every other Friday in that basement, still maintaining their structure and ensuring compliance, still making people disappear when they ask too many questions. Everyone wants the full story, but here's the thing. I can't give it to them. The detectives, the therapists, my own parents sitting across from me with those desperate eyes, they all want this clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. What I've got instead are these jagged pieces of memory that don't fit together right, like a puzzle someone threw against a wall. What I can tell you is where it started. A Friday night in September, me and 4 friends driving out to some abandoned trailer park off Highway 56 because we were 17 and stupid and thought we were invincible. My buddy Josh had been going on about this place for weeks, saying his older brother told him squatters had turned it into some kind of commune. The kind of place where people went to disappear on purpose, he said, which should have been our first clue to stay the hell away. But when you grow up in a Kansas town where watching wheat grow counts as entertainment, an abandoned trailer park 12 miles outside town sounds like the most interesting thing that's happened all year. I remember climbing into Josh's pickup that night, the 5 of us passing around cheap vodka, laughing about nothing, completely unaware we were driving towards something that would break us all in different ways. The trailer park sat at the end of a dirt road that carved through an old cornfield, the kind that had been left to rot into these tall, dried-out husks that scraped against the truck as we drove through. Someone had spray-painted a crooked arrow on a rusted mailbox where we turned off the highway, pointing us deeper into nowhere. When Josh's headlights finally swept across the clearing, I counted maybe a dozen trailers arranged in this weird circle, most of them sagging on one side or covered in thick vines that made them look like they were being swallowed by the earth. The whole place had this carnival after dark feeling, like something that was supposed to be fun once but had turned into something else entirely. We sat there in the truck for a minute after Josh cut the engine, and that's when I heard it, this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere in the darkness. A generator, I realized, which meant someone was using electricity out here. Amber, Josh's girlfriend, said maybe we should just go, that if people were actually living here we were trespassing. But Josh was already laughing it off. He said anyone squatting in a place like this wasn't going to call the cops on some teenagers. Kevin had his door open before any of us could argue further, flashlight already on, heading toward the nearest trailer like he owned the place. The rest of us followed because that's what you do when you're 17. You follow your friends into the dark, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. The first trailer Kevin approached had its door hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. He stepped inside and we heard him moving around, his footsteps creaking on what sounded like rotted floorboards. When he came back out, he said it was empty, except for some old furniture and needles scattered everywhere, the kind with the orange caps that you see in documentaries about the opioid crisis. Josh made some joke about junkies and we moved to the next trailer, then the next, finding more of the same. Stripped mattresses, broken glass, that sour smell of mildew and something worse underneath. Stephanie hung back near the truck, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. She kept saying she wanted to leave, that this place felt wrong, but nobody really listened to her. We were too busy trying to act braver than we felt, shining our flashlights into dark corners and daring each other to go deeper into the trailers. It was Josh who noticed the trailer at the far end of the circle looked different from the others. Newer, or at least better maintained. The windows had curtains, actual curtains, not just sheets, and there was a concrete block serving as a front step. No vines growing up the sides. That generator sound was louder near this one, definitely coming from underneath or behind it. Kevin said we should check it out and Josh agreed immediately, like this was some kind of adventure game and we were collecting points. I remember my heart was pounding harder than it should have been, this animal part of my brain sending up warning flares. but I followed anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. We approached the trailer slowly, and that's when I noticed the door wasn't just closed. It had a deadbolt on the outside. A big industrial one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit, installed where someone inside couldn't reach it. Josh touched it and the metal was new. No rust like everything else in this place. Amber asked why anyone would lock a trailer from the outside, and nobody had an answer that made sense. Kevin tried the door anyway and it swung open. Unlocked, and the smell that came out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Chemical and sweet at the same time, with this underlying rot that made my eyes water. The inside was dark except for a faint blue glow coming from somewhere in the back. We stood in the doorway, none of us wanting to be the first one to step inside, and that's when we heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across floor, coming from deeper in the trailer. Something or someone was in there with us, moving in the darkness. Josh shined his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam landed on a figure slumped against the far wall, a woman maybe in her 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell. She was staring at us but not really seeing us, her eyes glassy and unfocused, and her lips were moving like she was talking, but no sound was coming out. She wore a stained tank top and her arms were covered in track marks, some fresh enough that they still looked angry and red. Kevin started backing up immediately, saying we needed to get out of there, that this was someone's shooting gallery and we were going to get in serious trouble. But Amber moved forward instead, asking the woman if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she made this wet clicking sound in her throat. And I realized she wasn't just high, she was barely conscious, maybe overdosing right in front of us. Stephanie was already running back to the truck, yelling that she was calling 911. But Josh grabbed her and said we couldn't call the cops because we'd been drinking and we'd all get arrested. We were arguing about what to do, our voices getting louder and more panicked, when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, multiple sets coming from different directions. The generator sound cut out and everything went silent, except for those footsteps getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to hide. My body just moved on its own, pulling me deeper into the trailer, away from the door. Josh and Amber ducked down behind a couch that was leaking stuffing, and Kevin pressed himself against the wall near the bathroom. The woman on the floor didn't react at all, just kept staring at nothing with that slack expression. Then there were voices outside, men's voices, speaking in quick Spanish that I couldn't fully understand, but the tone was clear. They were angry about something. A flashlight beam swept through the open door and someone shouted, asking who was out there, who'd been in their property. The beam landed on Stephanie, who'd only made it halfway to the truck before the lights came on. She stood there like a deer on the highway, caught completely, and I watched through the grimy window as 3 men emerged from between the trailers. They weren't what I expected. No face tattoos or gang colors, just regular-looking guys in work clothes, the kind you'd see at any construction site or farm supply store. One of them had a pistol tucked into his waistband. He walked up to Stephanie and asked her real calm where her friends were. Said he knew she hadn't come alone because he'd seen the truck. She didn't answer, couldn't answer probably, and he grabbed her arm and started walking her toward the center of the circle, toward the other trailers we hadn't explored yet. That's when Josh made the stupidest decision of his life and ran out after her. He was yelling something about leaving her alone, about how we were just kids and we'd leave and never come back. But his voice cracked halfway through and it just sounded pathetic and desperate. The man with the gun didn't even hesitate. He pulled it out and pointed it at Josh's chest, told him to get on his knees right now or he'd put a hole in him. Josh dropped like his legs had been cut out from under him. Amber started crying next to me, these quiet hiccuping sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand, and I clamped my own hand over her mouth because I knew if they heard us, we were done. Through the window I watched as 2 more men appeared, one of them talking on a cell phone in rapid Spanish, and I caught enough words to understand they were calling someone, asking what to do about the kids who'd found the place. The man on the phone kept saying CC and nodding, and when he hung up his face looked grim. He walked over to Josh and Stephanie and told them they were going to take a little walk, that if they cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Josh asked what about his friends in the truck, lying badly, and the man smiled this thin smile and said they'd find them too, not to worry. They started walking, the two of them, toward the far side of the circle, toward trailers I now realized had been modified somehow, with metal reinforcements around the doors and windows that looked like bars. Kevin whispered that we had to run, right now while they were distracted, but I couldn't move. I was watching Josh and Stephanie being led away, and my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the floor behind us started making this horrible keening sound, this animal noise of pure distress, and one of the men heard it. He turned back toward our trailer and started walking, calling out to someone named Luis, saying he needed to check on the girl in number 7. That was us. We were in number 7. Amber bolted first, running out the back window that someone had left partially open, and Kevin went right after her. I should have followed immediately, but I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at that woman on the floor, who was clearly a prisoner here, clearly someone who needed help. And those 3 seconds cost me everything. The man came through the door just as I was climbing toward the window, and he grabbed my ankle and pulled hard. I hit the floor, and all the air went out of my lungs, and when I looked up, there was a different man standing over me, older than the others, with graying hair and these absolutely dead eyes. He said something in Spanish to the guy holding me, then switched to English and told me I'd made a very big mistake tonight. That they'd been running a good operation here for 2 years without problems, and now they had to figure out what to do with a bunch of nosy kids who couldn't mind their own business. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and walked me to one of the modified trailers, the one with the heaviest bars on the windows. Inside it was divided into compartments, these small rooms created with plywood walls that didn't reach the ceiling, and I could hear people in the other sections, breathing, shifting, someone crying softly. They shoved me into one of these rooms and the door had a padlock on the outside, just like that first trailer. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. There was sound insulation stapled to the walls, the kind you see in recording studios, which explained why nobody outside had ever heard anything from this place. Josh was in the compartment next to mine. I could hear him through the thin plywood, asking if I was okay, his voice shaking. Stephanie was somewhere further down, calling out for Amber and Kevin, begging them to get help. One of the men banged on the wall and told us to shut up or he'd give us something to really cry about. The hours that followed are the blurriest part of my memory. I know we were kept in those rooms while they decided what to do with us. I know they brought us water and these protein bars that tasted like cardboard, keeping us alive but barely. I know Josh tried to kick his door down at some point and they came in and beat him badly enough that he stopped making noise for a long time. What I learned later, after everything, was that Amber and Kevin had made it back to the highway. They'd run through that cornfield in complete darkness, getting cut up by the dried stalks, and flagged down a semi-truck around 3 in the morning. The driver let them use his CB radio to call for help, and they told the police everything: the trailer park, the men with guns, their 3 friends who'd been taken. But here's the thing about Kansas County police departments at 3 in the morning. They're understaffed and skeptical, especially when 2 drunk teenagers show up with a story about armed men and kidnapping in an abandoned trailer park that most locals didn't even know existed. The officer who responded thought they were either pulling a prank or had gotten into some kind of drug deal gone wrong. He drove out to Highway 56 with them at dawn, but couldn't find the turnoff they described. That spray-painted arrow on the mailbox was gone, painted over with brown that matched the rust. The dirt road through the cornfield had been smoothed out somehow, and without that clear path, the officer didn't want to drive his cruiser through private farmland on the word of 2 scared kids who couldn't give him an exact location. He took a report and told them he'd follow up, but Amber said she could tell he didn't believe them. It took 3 days and both sets of parents raising hell before the sheriff's department organized a real search, and by then we'd been moved. They transported us at night in a panel van with no windows, drove for what felt like hours on roads that went from paved to gravel to dirt. When they finally let us out, we were at a different location entirely, some kind of warehouse or industrial building that smelled like chemicals, and had these huge ventilation fans running constantly. The operation was bigger than I'd understood. There were maybe 20 other people being held there, ranging from teenagers to people in their 40s, all in various states of withdrawal or sedation. I realized we'd stumbled into something way beyond a local drug operation. They were using people as mules, as labor, as leverage against family members who owed money. The man with the dead eyes, the one who seemed to be in charge, told us we'd work off our debt for trespassing and causing problems. He said we'd ruined a good setup and cost them money and having to relocate, so now we owed them. Josh kept insisting we were just kids, that our parents would pay whatever they wanted, but the man laughed and said our parents couldn't pay what we'd cost them. For weeks, maybe months, time stopped meaning anything in that place. We sorted pills, packaged powder into baggies, loaded and unloaded trucks that came in the middle of the night. They kept us compliant with just enough food to function and occasional doses of something that made everything feel far away and unimportant. Stephanie stopped talking after the first week. Josh tried to escape once and they broke 3 of his fingers as a lesson to the rest of us. The fragmented memories I have are mostly from this period. Days blending together, the constant noise of those ventilation fans, the chemical taste in my mouth that never went away. But I also remember the moment everything changed. A woman showed up one day, someone new they'd brought in, and she was different from the rest of us. She wasn't scared, she was angry, loudly, violently angry, screaming at the guards about a lawyer and her husband, and how people knew where she was. They tried to shut her up, but she wouldn't stop, and I think that's what finally brought attention to the place. Because 3 days after she arrived, I woke up to the sound of doors being smashed in and men in tactical gear yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Federal agents, it turned out, DEA and FBI. They'd been investigating the drug ring for over a year, but couldn't find their main distribution center until this woman, a county prosecutor's wife who'd been grabbed by mistake, a case of mistaken identity, went missing, and her husband tore apart every lead with resources we never had. They raided 4 locations simultaneously that morning in January, recovered 37 people total, and arrested 23 men connected to an operation that stretched from the Midwest to the East Coast. Josh, Stephanie, and I were separated immediately, taken to different hospitals, debriefed by so many different agencies that their faces all blur together now. My parents cried when they saw me, and I couldn't cry back. I'd forgotten how, somewhere in those months. The worst part was learning that Kevin had died 2 weeks after escaping. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, his truck running, officially ruled an accident, but everyone who knew him understood what it really was. The guilt of leaving us behind had eaten him alive. They tell me I should feel lucky to be alive, that most people in situations like ours don't come home at all. The prosecutors used our testimony to put away the main operators for life, and the FBI shut down the entire network. That trailer park off Highway 56 was bulldozed within a month of our rescue. The whole area fenced off and turned into nothing, like it never existed at all. Josh moved to Colorado with his family right after the trials ended. I heard he's doing better now, working at a ski resort, trying to build a normal life. Stephanie's in intensive therapy somewhere on the East Coast. Her parents won't say where exactly. Amber finished high school online and left town the day she turned 18. I stayed because running felt like letting them win, even though I see that warehouse every time I close my eyes and smell those chemicals every time it rains. My high school graduating class walked in 2014 and I wasn't there. I was still doing physical therapy, still trying to remember how to be a person instead of just a body that follows orders. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the kid who survived that thing with the drug trailers, and they get this look like they want to ask questions but don't know how. I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to ask either. The detectives say my fragmented memory is normal for trauma, that pieces might come back or they might not, and I should focus on moving forward instead of trying to reconstruct everything. But here's what I know for certain. There are more places like that warehouse out there. More operations running right now in spaces people drive past every day without noticing. And there are still people in those places. waiting for someone to stumble across them the way we did, hoping their luck turns out better than ours. My cousin Rita had this way of making everything seem fixable, even when it wasn't. Wednesday evening in January 2024, I sat at her kitchen table just outside Springfield, Missouri, signing papers that ended my marriage while she heated up leftover pot roast and told me about her plans for spring planting. My birthday had passed the week before. 39 felt different than 38 somehow, heavier. And here I was starting from scratch with a new apartment in town and a job that kept me staring at wrecked cars all day. Insurance adjusting pays decent, but it teaches you to see damage everywhere, calculate loss like it's just numbers on a form. Rita kept the conversation light, asked about work, avoided mentioning my ex-wife's name. By the time I left around 7, the sun had already set, leaving that dead gray light that makes Missouri winter feel twice as cold. County Road 48 was my usual route home, 40 minutes of farmland and scattered houses set so far back from the road you could barely see them. I'd driven it 100 times, knew every curve and dip. Around mile marker 31, my 2015 Ford F-150 started making this grinding noise that shot straight through the floorboard. The engine shuddered hard, the whole truck vibrated, and then everything just quit. I managed to coast onto the shoulder near a beaten mailbox with Pruitt spray-painted crooked across the front. Tried the ignition 3 times, got nothing but clicking and that horrible metal-on-metal sound. One car passed without slowing, taillights vanishing around the bend like it couldn't get away fast enough. I pulled out my phone, saw 2 bars of signal, and searched for a tow truck. Most of the big companies showed wait times over an hour. Then I found Anchor Towing. Local number, promised 15-minute response, available all hours. I called, and a man answered so fast I barely heard it ring, his voice gravelly and worn, like he'd been waiting by the phone. He asked where I was, and I told him County Road 48, near the Pruitt mailbox at mile marker 31. He didn't ask for more details, didn't need the make and model of my truck, nothing about what was wrong with it. Just said, "Yeah, I know where that is. Be there in 10, and hung up before I could even say thanks. The whole call lasted maybe 20 seconds. I sat there in the cab, heater still blowing cold air because the engine was dead, and realized I hadn't asked about the price or what shop he was taking me to. But honestly, I just wanted to get home, peel off these clothes that still smelled like Rita's kitchen, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. The road stayed empty. No headlights in either direction, just the wind pushing dead leaves across the asphalt, and the distant shape of a barn I could barely make out against the darkening sky. Then, headlights appeared from the direction I'd come, moving fast. Way faster than you'd expect a tow truck to move, especially on a road like this with all its turns. The lights swept around the bend, and I could see it wasn't one of those big professional rigs with the company name plastered across the side in bright letters. It was a Chevy Silverado, maybe early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the fading light. It had a tow bar welded to the back, and one of those yellow rotating beacons on the roof. The kind you can buy at any auto parts store and stick on with a magnet. On the driver's door was a decal, Anchor Towing with an anchor symbol and a phone number, but it looked homemade, like someone had printed it on their computer and stuck it on with adhesive. The truck pulled up behind mine and the driver got out, leaving his headlights on so they lit up the whole scene in harsh white light that made everything look strange and flat. The guy who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a stained Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His face was hard to make out with the headlights behind him, but I could see he was older, probably in his 50s, with a gray beard that needed trimming and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down, cold air rushing in. He smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, that combination every mechanic seems to carry around like cologne. "Engine's done, huh?" he said, not really asking. His voice was the same one from the phone, rough and flat, no warmth in it. I nodded and explained the grinding noise, how everything just died, and he listened without looking at me, his eyes scanning my truck like he was appraising it. When I finished talking, he just said, "I'll hook you up, take you to my shop. It's about 20 minutes from here, just off Highway 12. He didn't mention a price, didn't ask if I wanted to call anyone, didn't hand me a business card or a form to sign. He worked fast, moving around to the back of my truck with a chain that clanked loud in the quiet. I got out to watch, mostly because sitting in the cab doing nothing made me feel useless, and also because some part of me, the part that spends all day documenting accident scenes, wanted to see how he was rigging it up. The setup looked solid enough, chains looped through the frame, hooks secured, but there was something sloppy about it, like he'd done this 1,000 times and stopped caring about the details. He worked without talking, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask what I did for a living, none of that casual conversation tow truck drivers usually throw at you to fill the silence. When he finished, he straightened up and said, "You can ride with me or stay in your truck, doesn't matter." His tone made it clear he didn't care either way. I hesitated, looking between his Silverado and my F-150, and something in my gut twitched, just a small, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. But I was tired, emotionally wrung out, and this guy was my ride. I told him I'd stay in my truck. He shrugged like I'd just told him the sky was blue and walked back to his Silverado without another word. I climbed into my F-150, settled into the driver's seat even though I had no control anymore, and watched through the rear window as he got into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, louder than it should have been, and then we started moving. The jerk when we first pulled onto the road was rough, rattled my teeth, but then it smoothed out into this weird gliding feeling, being pulled along by someone else's momentum. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit up showing 7:30, and watched the road slide past in reverse through my side mirror. We went maybe 2 miles before he made a turn I didn't recognize, onto a narrower road with no street sign, just gravel and dirt packed hard from years of use. Trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping the top of my truck with this rhythmic scratching sound that set my nerves on edge. That's when I realized I had no idea where this shop was supposed to be. He'd said Highway 12, but we were heading away from it, deeper into back roads I'd never been on. I tried to remember if there were any repair shops out this way and came up blank. My phone still had 1 bar of signal, just barely hanging on. I thought about calling Rita, telling her where I was, but what would I even say? That I had a bad feeling about the tow truck driver who was doing exactly what I'd paid him to do. That sounded paranoid, like the stress of the day was making me see danger where there wasn't any. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the phone tighter, and I kept watching the trees pass by, looking for something familiar, some landmark that would tell me we were going the right direction. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, and that horrible scratching sound every time a branch dragged across my roof. Then he turned again, onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the pavement gave way entirely to dirt. The beacon on his roof kept spinning, throwing yellow light across the trees in sick rotating patterns. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he slowed down near a clearing on the left side of the road. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a structure, maybe a shed or a small building, set back about 30 feet from the road. No lights on inside, no sign, nothing that looked like a legitimate repair shop. Just a dark shape against darker trees. My entire body went rigid. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He pulled to a stop and the Silverado's engine kept running, that rough idle vibrating through the chains into my truck. I watched him in the side mirror, saw him open his door and step out, moving toward the back where the chains were connected. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was hooked to his truck, couldn't drive away even if my engine worked. My phone showed no signal now, just an empty bar mocking me in the corner of the screen. I locked my doors, stupid, pointless, but it was all I could think to do. He appeared at my window, standing there in the yellow rotating light, and tapped on the glass with his knuckle. Not aggressive, just a casual tap, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't roll it down. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly now, and there was something empty in his expression, mechanical, like he was going through motions he'd rehearsed. He said something I couldn't hear through the window, gestured toward the building. I shook my head, held up my phone, pointed at the screen showing no signal, then made a gesture like I was calling someone. Universal sign for, I'm not getting out. I have people who know where I am. Complete lie, but I sold it hard. His face didn't change. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, just staring at me through the glass. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his own phone, looked at it, put it back in his pocket and walked back to his truck without saying another word. I heard his door slam and then nothing happened. We just sat there, his engine running, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then headlights appeared behind us, coming up the dirt road fast. A vehicle rounded the bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my entire life. It was a patrol car, county sheriff, and it pulled up maybe 20 feet behind the Silverado with its lights going. A deputy got out, flashlight in hand, and walked up to the driver's side of the tow truck. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the deputy's posture change, see him step back and put his hand near his belt. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, and then the deputy walked over to my window. I rolled it down immediately, cold air rushing in along with the sound of the deputy's radio crackling. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a clean-shaved face and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice had that careful calm cops use when they think something's wrong, but don't want to spook anyone. I told him I'd called for a tow. My truck broke down on County Road 48, and this guy showed up saying he'd take me to his shop. The deputy nodded slowly, glanced back at the Silverado, then asked me, "Did you get a card or any paperwork from him?" I said no, and his jaw tightened just slightly. The deputy told me to stay put and walked back to the Silverado. Whatever he said to the driver made the guy get out of his truck with his hands visible, and within minutes another patrol car showed up, then another. They had the driver standing by the hood of his Silverado, talking to him, checking his identification, running something on their radios. One of the deputies came over and explained they'd been looking for this guy for 3 weeks. Apparently there'd been a string of incidents, people calling for tow trucks on rural roads, drivers showing up fast with homemade decals and no legitimate business license, then either robbing the stranded motorists or, in 2 cases, the people in their vehicles just vanished entirely until their trucks were found abandoned days later in different counties. The fake tow driver would target people alone on empty roads, use the isolation against them, and the decal on his door could peel right off when he was done. They'd been tracking reports but couldn't pin him down until tonight. The deputy said the only reason they found me was because someone had called in a suspicious vehicle, matching the description heading down this road. Probably a neighbor who'd seen the beacon light through the trees and thought it was strange. They unhooked my truck right there on the dirt road and called a legitimate towing company out of Springfield to come get me. Took another hour before they arrived, and I spent that time sitting in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around my shoulders, watching them process the scene. The building in the clearing turned out to be an abandoned hunting cabin. Nothing inside but some old furniture and evidence of other people having been there recently. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. The deputy who'd found me said I'd gotten lucky in ways I probably didn't fully understand yet, that staying in my truck and refusing to get out had likely saved my life. When the real tow truck finally showed up, a bright red rig with the company name in huge letters and a driver who had paperwork and a business card, and asked me a dozen questions about my insurance, I felt like I could breathe again. They took me and my F-150 to a shop in town, and I called Rita from there around midnight to tell her what happened. She cried, which made me realize how close I'd actually come to not making that call at all. The guy they arrested turned out to have a record: assault, theft, a bunch of other charges going back years. I had to give a statement to the police, went through the whole thing again in detail, and they told me I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial. I said I would, absolutely, whatever they needed. That was 3 months ago now, and I still won't drive County Road 48 at night, still check the credentials of any service person before they touch my vehicle, still get a knot in my chest when I see a tow truck beacon spinning in the dark. Some guy in a fake uniform with a homemade decal almost made me disappear, And the only reason I'm here typing this is because I listened to that small, uncomfortable feeling in my gut and refused to get out of my truck. Trust that feeling. Always. Folks around our town always said the bridge at Mason Creek had a bad feeling to it. It sits about 3 miles past the diner where I work, tucked behind a patch of pine trees and fog that never really lifts. The asphalt there crumbles into dirt, and when the wind blows through, it whistles through the cracks like the bridge is breathing. I had lived in Claymore all my life, waiting tables since I was 18, and I knew every regular's car by sight. That is why, when I drove home after my shift one night and saw a silver Honda parked near the guardrail with no lights on, it caught my attention immediately. At first, I figured someone broke down. Happens all the time when folks take the back roads to avoid the state patrol. But when I passed by the next night and saw a different car in almost the same spot, an old maroon Buick this time, I felt a strange sense of repetition that stuck with me. People in town started whispering about it too. A delivery guy said he'd seen 3 cars left there in the last week, always after midnight, always gone by morning. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and nobody really wanted to stop and check. Then came the night I noticed a beat-up blue Ford Fusion parked right under the bridge's main arch. I recognized it right away. It belonged to Casey, one of the waitresses who worked the late shift with me at the diner. Casey had been covering extra hours because her boyfriend lost his job, and she usually left around the same time I did. Seeing her car sitting there, engine off, door slightly cracked open, made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled over a little ahead of the bridge, cut the headlights, and just sat there, watching the Ford. The whole place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bridge lights had gone out years ago, so the only thing I could see was the faint gleam of metal from the car's bumper catching my high beams. I called Casey's phone, no answer. Tried again, nothing. That was when I noticed a faint flicker of light inside her car, like someone using a flashlight or maybe a lighter. It blinked twice, then disappeared. For a few seconds I thought about turning around and pretending I never saw it. But curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling just in case I needed to bolt. The air smelled like wet iron, sharp and heavy. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to Casey's car, calling her name softly. No answer. I peeked through the driver's window and saw her purse still on the seat, her phone face down beside it, the screen cracked. But the back seat was empty. That small light I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore, and the silence felt deeper, as if the woods had stopped breathing too. Something about that bridge always messed with radios, but I had my work walkie-talkie in my apron pocket from the diner. It wasn't meant for long distance, yet a faint voice came through when I turned it on. Static first, then a man's voice. Steady, low, like he was talking right next to my ear. "You out here too?" he said. I froze in place, listening. The signal hissed, then he spoke again. "Bridge is quiet tonight, just the way I like it." His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of bridge ahead. There were faint tire marks near the guardrail, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. That was when I heard it, the slow grind of a diesel engine starting somewhere beyond the trees, the kind of deep rumble you feel in your ribs. The sound echoed under the bridge, bouncing around like it had nowhere else to go. I crouched behind Casey's car, heart hammering, and watched as a semi-truck's headlights blinked on in the distance. It crept forward like it was stalking something. The driver never used the horn, never flashed the brights, just rolled closer until the grille reflected in the water beneath the bridge. I caught a glimpse of the trailer's paint, dull red with peeling white letters that might have once spelled a company name. I remember thinking that whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. The truck stopped in the middle of the bridge, its headlights dimmed, leaving everything bathed in weak moonlight. A voice crackled through my walkie again. Same man, same calm tone. "She came out to meet me, you know. Said she heard me calling." My chest tightened. Casey had told me once she liked to listen to old CB channels while closing up the diner. Said they made the drive home less lonely. The man kept talking, describing her hair, her voice, how she sounded scared when she realized there was no signal down here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then the truck's door opened. I could see the driver's outline against the cab light, broad shoulders, baseball cap, face hidden by shadow. He leaned out and tossed something over the bridge rail. It hit the water with a soft splash. I felt my throat close up. The radio clicked again, quieter now. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. His engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled off into the trees, taillights fading until the night swallowed them whole. I didn't go to the police until morning. When they checked the bridge, they found Casey's phone, the same one I'd seen in her car, shattered near the guardrail. They said the signal from her last call had bounced off an unregistered frequency, one the highway patrol hadn't used in decades. A few weeks later, they traced similar disappearances to truck stops along the interstate, each near a bridge, each victim last heard talking on CB channels no one was supposed to be using anymore. To this day, that stretch of road stays empty after dark. People in Claymore say it's haunted, but I don't think it's ghosts keeping folks away. Sometimes late at night, the diner's radio picks up faint chatter from a channel that shouldn't exist. Just a man's voice, clear as if he's sitting at the counter. "Anyone out there near the bridge?" he says. It's real quiet tonight. Classes had been exhausting that semester, and I was desperate for a quiet weekend to make some money. When my roommate mentioned a family who needed a babysitter for 2 nights, it felt like a perfect break from the campus chaos. The family lived in a tidy 2-story house on the edge of a small Oregon town. Quiet, tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know each other. The mother, Erin, met me at the door with the kind of warmth that felt practiced, but not unkind. Her husband, Patrick, was supposedly leaving that evening for a business trip to Portland, and the 2 kids, Max and Lily, were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Erin gave me a quick tour of the house, moving a little too fast through each room, pointing out the snacks, the camera monitors, the back door, the alarm code. She kept saying how much she appreciated me coming on short notice. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned Patrick's trip, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Before she left, she kissed both kids on the forehead, reminded me not to open the door for anyone, and promised to be back by late morning. When the door clicked shut, the silence in that big house felt heavier than it should have. The night started out fine. Max and Lily were good kids, restless but polite. We played a board game, watched an old animated movie, and they fell asleep by 9. After cleaning up the living room, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The only light came from the little night bulb over the sink, making everything look faded and distant. The house felt peaceful, almost too still, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 dull taps on the back door, slow and deliberate. I figured it might be a neighbor, someone who had noticed Erin's car gone and wanted to check in. Still, something in the rhythm of those knocks made me hesitate. I opened the kitchen tablet to check the porch camera. The grainy feed lit up, and I swear my breath caught when I saw the man on the screen. Patrick, standing there in the cold, his face lit by the porch light. At first I thought maybe the trip had been canceled, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, staring straight into the camera, made my throat tighten. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing in the same position, his hands at his sides. The porch light flickered once, and the feed glitched for half a second. When it came back, he was gone. I remember walking to the door and checking the lock twice before stepping back and texting Erin. No answer. Then I called her. Straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, a soft scratching sound came from the side of the house, like branches scraping the siding, except there were no trees close enough for that. I turned off the kitchen light to get a clearer view through the window. Outside, the yard looked empty. The swing set in the corner moved slightly, just enough to catch the light. I could not tell if it was the wind or something else. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed the house phone, yes, an actual landline, and kept it next to me. When the knocks started again, they were louder, faster. The kids upstairs began to stir. I heard Max's small voice call out, asking if everything was okay. I lied and told him it was just a neighbor. My voice must have sounded wrong because he came to the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket. I told him to stay with his sister, locked the kitchen door again, and turned the deadbolt twice. Then I checked the camera feed one more time. Patrick was back. His face was closer now, his expression flat, as if he were watching something beyond the lens. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, whispering the address while keeping my eyes on the screen. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure it was the homeowner. I said yes, absolutely sure. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside. I remember feeling this strange mixture of relief and disbelief. I had seen his face earlier that evening when he hugged the kids goodbye. There was no mistaking him, but the man on that screen looked wrong somehow. The same features, same clothes, but a blankness in his eyes that I can't describe. The police took about 15 minutes to arrive, though it felt much longer. During that time, I kept every light in the house off and sat at the bottom of the stairs listening. I could hear something faint outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel, slow and uneven. Then the sound of a car door shutting somewhere nearby. I waited for a knock at the front door, but it never came. When red and blue lights finally flashed through the curtains, I ran to open the door before they even stepped out of the car. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with me and the kids. They found footprints near the back porch, leading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. I remember one of them saying the prints matched heavy boots, not sneakers or dress shoes. When they ran Patrick's name through their system, the mood shifted instantly. One of the officers made a quick call and stepped outside. A few minutes later, he came back pale-faced and told me Patrick was confirmed to be in Portland. His body had been found in a motel parking lot earlier that evening. Aaron returned the next morning in tears, escorted by detectives. The truth unfolded in fragments. Months of violence hidden behind closed doors, reports she never filed, neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet. Patrick had apparently left town 2 days earlier after a violent argument, but something or someone wearing his face came back that night. The officers never found any signs of forced entry, and the camera feed from that moment somehow vanished from the cloud storage before they could retrieve it. I quit babysitting after that. Aaron and the kids moved away not long later. Every once in a while, I'll see a man on the street with the same posture, the same way of standing perfectly still like Patrick did on that porch. And for a second, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too thick. I try not to think about what I saw on that screen, or who, if anyone, was actually standing outside that door. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. June of 2018 was when everything changed for me, when my faith in the badge and the uniform got tested in ways they never prepare you for at the academy. 26 and already 4 years into highway patrol, I thought I'd seen enough late-night wrecks and DUIs to last a lifetime working the graveyard shift on State Route 47. Most nights consisted of speeding tickets, the occasional drunk driver, maybe helping someone with a flat tire on that long stretch of nothing between Millbrook and Canton. My sergeant used to joke that the most dangerous part of our job was staying awake through those endless dark hours when the radio stayed quiet and the road stretched empty for miles. But that particular Thursday night in June taught me that sometimes the quiet is when you need to be most alert, when predators count on your routine and isolation to spring their trap. Dispatch came through at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the dead silence in my patrol car like a knife. Single vehicle accident, Possible rollover. Caller reported someone pinned and bleeding badly on Old Quarry Road about 8 miles past the county line. I knew that stretch well. A narrow 2-lane that curved through dense pine forest with no streetlights, no houses, just an abandoned limestone quarry that shut down in the 90s. The dispatcher, Nancy, sounded frustrated as she relayed the information. Said the call dropped after maybe 20 seconds and she couldn't get the person back on the line. Cell service out there was spotty at best. Dead zones everywhere between the hills. Protocol said wait for backup on remote calls, but when someone's bleeding out, every second matters. I flipped on my lights and pushed the Crown Vic hard through those winding curves, telling Nancy I'd assess the scene first while she tried to route an ambulance from the county hospital. Old Quarry Road appeared in my headlights like a tunnel carved through solid darkness, the pine trees creating walls on both sides that seemed to swallow the light. I kept my spotlight sweeping left and right, looking for any sign of a vehicle off the road or debris that might indicate where someone went over. After about 3 miles in, I spotted it. Fresh tire marks veering hard right, straight through the soft shoulder and into the tree line. My spotlight caught the gleam of metal maybe 30 feet down the embankment. A silver sedan wrapped around a massive oak tree, the driver's side completely crushed. Steam still rose from under the crumpled hood, and I could see dark stains on the shattered windshield that made my gut tighten. I grabbed my flashlight and medical kit, radioing my position to Nancy while I half slid down the muddy slope, my boots struggling for purchase on the wet leaves. When I reached the vehicle, a 2012 Toyota Camry according to the twisted remnants of the trunk badge, the smell hit me first. Copper and gasoline mixed with pine sap and damp earth. Blood covered the driver's seat, pooled on the floor, splattered across the dashboard in a pattern that seemed wrong somehow. Too deliberate, like someone had thrown it rather than bled it. No body though, no victim trapped behind the wheel or thrown through the windshield. I circled the car with my flashlight, checking the back seat, the surrounding brush, calling out for anyone who might have crawled away injured. That's when I noticed the phone, an old iPhone propped carefully on the passenger seat, screen glowing with an active call. A woman's voice played on speaker, desperate and looping. "Please help me, oh God, please, he's coming back, I can hear him. Please somebody help me." The recording repeated every few seconds the same terrified plea, and I realized with a cold certainty that this wasn't a voicemail or a pocket dial. Someone had recorded this and left it playing. I reached for my radio, keeping my other hand on my service weapon as an instinct I couldn't quite explain kicked in. "Nancy, we've got a situation here. This doesn't look right. Possible false report. Requesting immediate backup to my location." Static crackled back at me, then Nancy's voice choppy and breaking up. "Unit 47, say again, you're breaking up. Did you find the victim?" I tried adjusting the radio, moving away from the car to get better reception, but the static only got worse. My GPS unit on the dashboard started flickering, the location jumping around before going dark entirely. Training told me to get back to my vehicle, establish communication, wait for backup, but then I saw headlights crest the ridge about half a mile behind where I'd parked. Not the emergency lights of an ambulance or another patrol car, just regular headlights, moving slow and deliberate down the road toward my position. The headlights stopped about 200 yards from my patrol car, sitting there in the darkness, engine running. I could hear it idling, a diesel sound, heavy like a truck or a large SUV. My radio crackled again and Nancy's voice came through clearer this time. All units, we have a second 911 call reporting shots fired on Old Quarry Road. Caller says an officer is down. Requesting all available units respond code 3. My blood turned to ice because I hadn't heard any shots, hadn't reported being fired upon, and I was the only officer on this road. Someone was calling in false reports, trying to flood the scene with responders, or maybe trying to confuse dispatch about what was really happening. I keyed my radio. "Nancy, this is Unit 47. I'm code 4. No shots fired. This is a setup. Tell responding units to approach with extreme caution." But when I released the button, I only heard that same static, like something was jamming the frequency. Movement in my peripheral vision made me spin toward the tree line on the opposite side of the road from the wrecked car. 3 figures emerged from the woods, walking steady and purposeful toward my position, spread out in what we called a tactical formation at the academy. They wore dark clothing, faces obscured by baseball caps and bandanas, and I could see the outline of long guns in their hands. My training kicked in hard: multiple hostiles, superior firepower, compromised communications, isolated location. This wasn't random. They'd studied our response protocols, knew a lone officer would respond to a bleeding victim call, knew the dead zones where radios failed, knew exactly how long it would take backup to arrive even with a shots-fired call. I moved behind the patrol car's engine block, drawing my Glock 22, knowing 15 rounds wouldn't mean much against 3 rifles, but having no other option. A fourth figure appeared near the vehicle that had stopped up the road, talking into what looked like a handheld radio or phone. The 3 approaching gunmen stopped about 50 yards out, taking positions behind trees, and I heard one of them laugh, a sound that carried clear in the still night air. They weren't rushing, weren't shouting commands, just waiting, and that patience terrified me more than aggression would have. These weren't meth heads or desperate criminals making impulsive decisions. This was calculated, rehearsed, professional. The recording on the phone in the crashed car kept playing its loop, that woman's voice begging for help, and I understood now it was meant to keep me here, to make me hesitate about leaving a potential victim. Every detail had been planned. The blood to make it look real, the phone to sell the emergency, the GPS jammer to prevent tracking, the false 911 calls to confuse response. They'd turned our own procedures into a weapon against us. The smart play was getting back in my patrol car and ramming through whatever they'd set up, but I knew they'd anticipated that too. Sure enough, when I glanced toward my vehicle, I saw liquid spreading under it, pooling dark and reflective in the moonlight. They'd punctured my fuel tank while I was down at the crashed car, probably with a suppressed rifle shot I hadn't even heard. The Crown Vic might make it a mile, maybe 2 before dying, and then I'd be on foot with armed pursuers who knew this terrain. My vest would stop pistol rounds but not rifle fire, and they had all the advantages: numbers, firepower, preparation, position. I needed to buy time, needed backup to actually receive those false reports and come running, needed to survive the next few minutes until help arrived. The fourth figure by the truck raised something to his shoulder, and I saw the distinctive profile of a scoped rifle. Instead of taking the shot they expected, I did something that probably saved my life. I grabbed the phone from the crashed car and hurled it as far as I could into the woods opposite from the gunman, then immediately sprinted toward the steep embankment that led down to the old quarry access road. The recorded voice sailed through the air, still pleading for help, and I heard shouting behind me, confusion as they tried to track both the phone and my movement in the darkness. Branches tore at my uniform as I half fell, half controlled my descent down the 40-foot slope, using trees to slow my momentum, my duty belt catching on roots and rocks. A rifle cracked above me and bark exploded from a pine tree inches from my head. Then another shot sparked off a boulder to my left. They were shooting at sound and movement, not clear targets, which meant their night vision wasn't perfect. I reached the bottom and found the old gravel service road that connected to the quarry, oriented myself, and started running hard toward the main highway 3 miles away, my boots pounding on the loose stones. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, coordinated pursuit with one group following my path, while another probably circled around to cut me off at the highway. My radio suddenly burst to life with clear signal. Nancy's voice urgent. "Unit 47, what's your status? We have multiple units 5 minutes out." I keyed the mic while running, breath coming in gasps. "Code 3, officers need help. 4 armed suspects, rifles, ambush scenario. Approaching Highway 12 from the quarry road on foot." The next 2 miles were the longest of my life, running in full gear, vest and duty belt weighing me down, listening for vehicles or footsteps behind me. I heard engines in the distance getting closer, and couldn't tell if it was the suspects or backup. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto Highway 12, 5 patrol cars were screaming toward me, lights painting the forest red and blue. I waved them down, pointing back toward the quarry road, and collapsed against the first unit that stopped, legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The aftermath revealed just how sophisticated the operation was. The crashed car was stolen 3 states over, the blood was pig's blood from a slaughterhouse, and the phone had been programmed to call 911 through a spoofed cell tower they'd set up in a van. Investigators found the same group had hit 2 other officers in neighboring states using similar tactics, one in Missouri who wasn't as lucky as me and took a round through his shoulder before backup arrived. They tracked the crew through the burner phones they'd used, tracing them to a militia group that specifically targeted law enforcement, studying our protocols through leaked training materials and emergency response recordings they'd obtained through FOIA requests. All 4 were arrested 2 weeks later during a raid on a compound in Arkansas, and they found maps of rural patrol routes, radio frequencies, and detailed notes on response times for dozens of jurisdictions. I still work highway patrol, but now on day shift in a more populated district, and I never respond to remote calls alone, no matter what the emergency sounds like. That woman's recorded voice still visits my dreams sometimes, pleading for help that was never real. A ghost created specifically to draw me into their crosshairs. Seven months have passed since that night, and I still avoid Interstate 24 whenever possible. People ask me why I quit trucking after 15 years on the road, why I sold my rig and took a desk job that pays half what I used to make. I tell them I got tired of the lifestyle, that my back couldn't handle those long hauls anymore, but the truth sits heavy in my chest like a stone I can't digest. I need to share what I saw, what I reported, what they found because of my call. Maybe putting it out here will help me sleep, without seeing those faces pressed against the glass, without hearing those sounds that weren't supposed to exist at a rest area 40 miles from nowhere. I'd been driving the Nashville to Memphis route for about 3 years by then, usually making 2 or 3 runs a week, hauling auto parts for a distribution center. That particular Monday in early October started like any other. I loaded up around noon and figured I'd push through to Memphis before stopping for my mandatory rest period. But my coffee thermos ran dry somewhere past mile marker 85, and my eyelids started getting heavy, so I decided to pull into the old rest area near the county line. Most truckers avoided that spot because the facilities were run down and the parking lot lights barely worked, but it was quiet and I just needed a few hours of sleep before continuing on. The parking lot had maybe 4 other trucks scattered around when I pulled in, which wasn't unusual for that time of evening. I parked near the edge where the trees gave some shade during the day, killed the engine, and climbed into my sleeper cab. I'd just gotten comfortable when I heard what sounded like someone yelling, but it was muffled and distant, like it was coming from behind the main building. At first I figured it was just drivers arguing over something stupid. Maybe someone had blocked someone else in, so I ignored it and tried to settle back down. But then I heard it again, higher pitched this time, almost like a woman screaming, and my whole body went rigid because there shouldn't have been any women at that rest area at 2 in the morning. I sat up and looked through my windshield toward the main building, a long concrete structure that housed the bathrooms and some old vending machines that hadn't worked in years. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, I could make out what looked like a newer addition, a metal building with a couple of floodlights aimed at a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." As I watched, that door opened and 2 men walked out, one in what looked like a uniform, maybe private security, and they were half carrying, half dragging someone between them. The person's head was down, their feet barely touching the ground, and even from that distance I could tell something was very wrong with how they were moving, like they couldn't support their own weight. They loaded the person into the back of a white van that I hadn't noticed before, parked right up against the building. One of the men slammed the door shut while the other walked around to the driver's side, and that's when I saw the logo on his shirt catch the light. Roadside Protection Services, with some kind of badge design underneath. The van pulled away, not toward the highway but down a service road that ran deeper into the woods behind the rest area. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but then I stopped because what would I even say? That I saw security guards putting someone in a van? They'd probably tell me it was none of my business. Maybe someone got sick or hurt, and they were taking them for help. But I couldn't ignore what I'd heard, those screams that didn't sound like someone who was hurt. They sounded like someone who was terrified. I decided to take a walk just to stretch my legs, I told myself. Maybe wander over toward that building and see if anything else seemed out of place. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy metal ones that doubles as a weapon if you need it to, and stepped out of my cab. The October air hit me like ice water, way colder than it should have been for that time of year, and I could smell something chemical in the air, like bleach mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The other trucks in the lot were all dark, their drivers probably asleep, and I felt completely alone as I started walking toward the main building. I circled around the side of the restroom building, staying in the shadows as much as possible, my heart hammering so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. The closer I got to that metal addition, the stronger that chemical smell became, and now I could hear other sounds, a low humming like industrial fans running, and underneath that, voices. Multiple voices, some talking, some crying, some just making these low moaning sounds that made my stomach turn. There was a window on the side of the building, covered with some kind of reflective film, but there was a corner where it had peeled away. I crept up to it, keeping my flashlight off, and pressed my eye to that small gap. What I saw in that room will haunt me until the day I die. There were mattresses on the floor, maybe 8 or 9 of them, each with a person curled up on it. Most were women. Young women, though. I spotted at least 2 who couldn't have been older than 16. Their wrists were zip-tied to metal rings bolted into the wall, giving them just enough slack to lie down but not enough to reach the door. Some were dressed in regular clothes that were torn and dirty. Others wore these cheap-looking robes that barely covered them. One girl near the window was awake, staring at nothing with eyes that looked completely empty, like she'd given up hoping anyone would find her. A man in that same Roadside Protection Services uniform sat in a chair by the door, scrolling through his phone like he was just pulling a regular security shift, like those weren't human beings chained to the walls around him. I backed away from that window, my legs shaking so bad I nearly fell. I needed to get back to my truck, call 911, call the FBI, call anybody who would listen. But as I turned to leave, a hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. Another security guard, this one bigger, with a scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled this cold smile and said, "You lost, driver?" I mumbled something about looking for the bathroom, but he wasn't buying it. His hand moved to his belt where I could see a gun holstered, and he said, "Bathrooms in the main building. This area's restricted. Company property." I nodded, started to walk away, and that's when I saw it. A state patrol car parked behind the building, partially hidden by a dumpster. The engine was running, but the lights were off. The guard must have seen me notice the patrol car because his whole demeanor changed. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath, and said, "You didn't see nothing tonight, understand? You're gonna walk back to your truck, you're gonna drive away, and you're gonna forget this rest stop exists. Otherwise, well, truckers go missing all the time. Dangerous highways, especially for drivers who stick their nose where it doesn't belong." He patted the gun on his hip to make sure I got the message. I nodded again, turned around, and forced myself to walk, not run, back to my truck. My whole body was screaming at me to sprint, but I knew he was watching. Probably had others watching too. When I finally made it to my cab, I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled out of that rest area as calm as I could manage, even though every instinct told me to floor it. I drove for about 5 miles before I pulled over at a gas station that was bright and busy, full of normal people doing normal things. My fingers were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to dial 911. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored at first, probably used to getting calls about fender benders and speeding complaints. But when I started describing what I'd seen, her voice changed completely. She kept me on the line, transferred me to someone else, then someone else again. Within 10 minutes, I was talking to an FBI agent who told me to stay exactly where I was, that they were sending someone to meet me immediately. 2 agents showed up within the hour, and I told them everything: the room, the girls, the security company, and most importantly, that state patrol car hidden behind the building. What happened next was all over the news for weeks, though they kept my name out of it, thank God. They raided that rest area just before dawn with a joint task force of FBI and state police from a different district, not local. They found 14 women and girls, the youngest just 15, all victims of trafficking. The Roadside Protection Services was a shell company that had somehow gotten a legitimate contract with the state to provide security for several rest areas along the interstate. They'd been using that cover to run their operation for almost 4 years. The real kicker came when they arrested everyone involved. Among them were 2 local cops who'd been using their patrol cars to transport victims and provide cover when needed. One of them was a sergeant with 18 years on the force, a family man with 3 kids who'd been living a complete double life. I testified before a grand jury 3 months later, behind a screen so the defendants couldn't see my face. All of them got convicted. The 2 cops got 25 to life, the security guards got similar sentences, and they tracked down 3 more people who were running the money side of things. The victims, the ones who survived, were given counseling and help starting over, though I doubt any amount of therapy erases what they went through. As for me, I couldn't drive truck anymore. Every rest stop looked sinister. Every security guard made me nervous, and I kept wondering how many other places like that are operating right now, hidden in plain sight. I work in a warehouse now, home every night, and I never take the interstate if I can avoid it. People think I'm paranoid when I tell them to be careful at rest stops, to never get out alone at night. But I know what's out there. I know that sometimes the people meant to protect us are the very ones doing the harm, and that knowledge changed something fundamental in how I see the world. Mile marker 142 on Highway 65 is where everything changed for me. I'd passed that same green sign probably 1,000 times during my years with Tennessee Highway Patrol, never thinking it would become a landmark I'd never forget. That Wednesday afternoon, traffic was light, just the usual mix of semis and commuters heading north toward Kentucky. 23 years wearing the badge teaches you to read vehicles like other people read faces, and that beat-up Corolla maintaining exactly 55 in the right lane was trying too hard to be nobody. Perfect speed, perfect lane position, like someone had coached the driver on how to be invisible. The spider web crack spreading across the left taillight gave me legal cause to make the stop. The driver pulled over with mechanical precision, positioning the car so perfectly parallel to the shoulder line it seemed practiced. Through my windshield, I watched him arrange both hands at 10 and 2 before I even stepped out of my cruiser. That kind of rehearsed compliance always makes me pay closer attention. I ran the plates while walking up, registered to a Paul Brennan from Cookeville, clean record, nothing remarkable. But when I reached his window and he rolled it down, the smell hit me immediately. Multiple air fresheners fighting each other, creating a chemical cloud that made my eyes water. His forehead gleamed with perspiration despite the 40-degree weather, and when he passed me his license, his fingers trembled enough to make the plastic card flutter like a moth wing. Paul Brennan matched his photo, but nothing else about him matched a normal traffic stop. He answered my questions about where he was headed with single words, Memphis, while his eyes kept flicking to his rearview mirror. Not checking for traffic, but checking his trunk area through the back window. Quick glances, then back to me, then to the trunk again. His breathing came in these controlled little bursts, like someone counting between inhales. I asked him to step out of the vehicle, and he complied so fast he nearly fell getting out. Standing there beside his car, he kept shifting his weight, rocking slightly, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The temperature was dropping as the sun set behind us, but fresh sweat kept beading on his upper lip. I asked him about the air fresheners, keeping my tone conversational, just curious why he needed so many. He stuttered through an explanation about buying the car used, said it had a smell he couldn't get out, something about spilled milk in the summer. But his voice cracked on the word summer, and he immediately looked at the trunk again. That's when I heard it, or thought I did. A soft thump from the rear of the vehicle. Could have been the exhaust cooling, could have been the wind hitting the car just right. Brennan heard it too because his whole body went rigid. He started talking faster, saying he really needed to get to Memphis, Had a job interview in the morning, couldn't be late. The words tumbled out while his feet stayed planted like they were glued to the asphalt. I told him I needed to check his vehicle, standard procedure for the taillight violation, make sure everything else was in working order. His face changed then, went from nervous to something else, something desperate. He asked if I had to, said he'd fix the taillight as soon as he got to Memphis, promised to get it done first thing. When I insisted, he took a step backward, just one step, but enough to make me adjust my stance. His keys were still in the ignition, engine running, and I could see him calculating distances. I've seen that look before, guys deciding whether to run or fight or comply. I kept my voice steady, told him this would just take a minute, asked him to pop the trunk. He said the latch was broken, said he'd been meaning to fix it, said a lot of things that didn't explain why his whole body was shaking now. I walked around to the trunk myself, Brennan trailing behind me, still talking about Memphis and interviews and broken latches. The trunk had scratches around the lock, fresh ones that gleamed silver against the faded paint. When I pressed the release button inside the car, nothing happened. Brennan said, "See, told you broken," but his voice had gone high and thin. I got my flashlight and crouched down, looking at the latch mechanism, and that's when I heard it clearly. Not a thump this time, but movement, deliberate movement, and what sounded like breathing that wasn't coming from Brennan or me. I stood up and looked him in the eye, told him to open the trunk right now. He shook his head, said he couldn't. Said, "Please, officer, just let me go. I'll throw away the taillight. I'll never drive through Tennessee again." I called for backup then, keeping my eyes on Brennan while I spoke into my radio. His shoulders sagged when he heard me give our location, and he sat down right there on the cold asphalt, put his head in his hands. Started saying he didn't know, they just paid him to drive, $500 to take the car to Memphis and leave it at a rest stop. Said he never looked, never asked questions, just needed the money. While we waited for backup, I kept hearing those sounds from the trunk, stronger now, rhythmic tapping like someone trying to signal. I told Brennan we were opening that trunk one way or another, and he just nodded, defeated. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a second key, one that wasn't on his main ring. Said they gave him this one separately, told him to never use it unless instructed. His hand shook so bad when he held it out that I had to take it from him. The key turned smooth in the lock, and the trunk popped open with a soft click. The smell hit first, human sweat and fear and something chemical, like chlorine. She was curled in the fetal position, a girl maybe 16 or 17, duct tape around her wrists and ankles, another piece hanging loose from her mouth where she'd managed to work it free. Her eyes were huge, blinking in the sudden light, and she made this sound, half sob, half gasp. I reached for her and she flinched back, pressing herself against the wheel well. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to speak, only a rasp came out. I told her she was safe now, kept repeating it while I cut the tape with my knife, but she kept staring past me at Brennan, who was crying now, saying over and over that he didn't know she was so young, didn't know anything except where to drive. Backup arrived in minutes, 2 more patrol cars and an ambulance that I'd requested the moment I saw her. The paramedics wrapped her in blankets, gave her water in small sips while checking her vitals. She'd been in that trunk for at least 8 hours, according to what she managed to whisper. Grabbed from a mall parking lot in Kentucky, she remembered a white van, then waking up in darkness hearing road noise. They'd moved her twice before Brennan's car, she said. Different vehicles each time, always at rest stops. While the EMTs worked on her, Brennan started talking to anyone who would listen. Names of rest stops, times he was supposed to arrive, a phone number that called him with instructions. He swore he thought he was moving drugs, said they told him it was pills, that the weird sounds were just the packages shifting. But his story kept changing, and we all knew he was lying about what he knew. The girl, Haley was her name, told us about hearing other voices when they transferred her. Not just one person, but several, speaking in code words about packages and delivery times. She'd memorized some of what she heard through the tape over her mouth, kept repeating it to herself to stay focused, to stay sane. Routes they mentioned, something about a warehouse near Louisville, regular runs every few days. The detectives who arrived started mapping it out while Haley was still in the ambulance. This wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic. This was organized, methodical, using people like Brennan who needed quick cash and wouldn't ask questions. The broken taillight hadn't even been accidental. Haley heard them talking about keeping speeds perfect, never giving cops a reason to stop them. But they couldn't control everything. Couldn't fix that crack that spread just enough to catch my eye at mile marker 142. What Brennan gave us that night opened everything up like pulling a thread on a cheap sweater. The phone number led to a burner, but the tower pings showed patterns, regular stops at specific locations across 3 states. Within a week, FBI got involved, found the warehouse Haley had heard them mention. 12 more girls were recovered over the next month, some who'd been missing for years, others grabbed just days before. The rest stops Brennan named were all monitored, and they caught 3 more drivers, each with their own story about easy money and not asking questions. Each arrest led to more phone numbers, more locations, more girls who made it home. They traced money transfers to accounts in 5 different states, fake businesses that existed only on paper, a whole network that had been operating for at least 3 years according to the federal prosecutors. Haley testified 8 months later, her voice steady in the courtroom as she identified 2 of the men who'd transferred her between vehicles. She'd gone back to school, was seeing a therapist, trying to piece her life back together. Her parents sent me a letter, thanking me for stopping that car, for noticing that taillight. But I keep thinking about all the other Corollas doing exactly 55, all the other drivers with perfect lane position and rehearsed compliance that I didn't stop. Brennan got 15 years as part of a plea deal for his cooperation. The investigation is still ongoing, they tell me. New leads coming in every week. I still patrol Highway 65, still pass mile marker 142 every shift. Now I watch for more than just broken taillights. I watch for cars trying not to exist, for drivers who know their scripts too well, for that particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with getting a ticket. Because now I know what might be in those trunks, who might be counting the minutes in darkness hoping someone notices something wrong enough to take a closer look. Six years into working Colorado State Patrol, I thought I'd developed pretty good instincts about when something was wrong. My 30th birthday was still 2 months out that March morning in 2017, and I'd pulled over enough vehicles on Interstate 70 to know the difference between someone who forgot to renew their tags and someone actively avoiding the DMV for a reason. The silver Dodge Caravan that passed my radar position near the Lyman exit had registration stickers that expired the previous July, faded and peeling at the edges. It was a Wednesday, clear and brutally cold, the kind of high plains weather where the sky stretches forever and there's nowhere to hide. I hit my lights and pulled out behind the van, watching as it drifted slowly onto the shoulder with this hesitant quality that made my gut tighten. Most people pull over quickly when they see the lights, annoyed but compliant. This driver took almost a quarter mile, like they were running through scenarios in their head. When I walked up to the driver's side window, a woman in her mid-40s smiled up at me with too many teeth showing. She had short brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and wore a purple fleece jacket with some motivational phrase stitched across the chest in white thread. Before I could say anything, she launched into this explanation about being a foster caregiver, transporting 3 children to Denver for a mandatory meeting with their caseworker. Her hands moved constantly while she talked, touching her necklace, adjusting her glasses, gripping the steering wheel. She told me her name was Denise Calabresi, and kept emphasizing how important it was that she get these kids to their appointment on time. Something about her energy felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech. I asked for her license and registration, and while she dug through her glove box, I looked past her into the back of the van. 3 children sat in the middle and rear seats, completely motionless. The oldest was a girl, maybe 9 or 10, with long dark hair hanging over her face as she slumped against the window. 2 younger boys occupied the other seats, their heads tilted forward at angles that looked painful. None of them moved, none of them blinked. They didn't even seem to register that a cop was standing 5 feet away. I asked Denise if the children were all right, keeping my voice casual, but watching her reaction carefully. She barely glanced back at them before answering that they were fine, just tired from the early morning start. She said she'd picked them up at 5 in the morning from a group home in Burlington, that they'd been up late the night before, that kids always fell asleep in the car. Her explanations came rapid fire, each one slightly different from the last, and she kept insisting we needed to get moving or they'd miss their appointment. I told her to sit tight while I ran her information, taking the license and registration back to my patrol car. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, a Colorado driver's license issued 2 years prior, vehicle registration in her name. But when I ran her license through dispatch, something felt wrong even before the response came back. The address on file was a P.O. box in Grand Junction, over 200 miles west. The vehicle had been purchased with cash 3 months earlier from a private seller in Pueblo. While I waited for more information, I kept watching the van in my rearview mirror. Denise sat rigid in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel, even though the engine was off. The children in the back hadn't shifted position at all, not once. The girl's head remained pressed against the window at the exact same angle. One of the boys had his mouth hanging open slightly, and in the 7 or 8 minutes I'd been sitting there, he hadn't closed it, or swallowed, or done any of the tiny unconscious movements that people make. That's when dispatch came back with additional details that changed everything. Denise Calabresi had a prior arrest in Utah from 2015 for child endangerment, charges that were later dropped. More concerning, the vehicle registration showed 5 previous owners in the past 18 months, which is practically unheard of for a 7-year-old minivan. Something about this entire situation had shifted from routine traffic stop to something much darker. I called for backup and approached the van again, this time asking Denise to step out of the vehicle. Her smile finally disappeared. She stepped out slowly, still talking, still trying to control the narrative. She pulled a manila folder from the passenger seat and thrust it toward me, saying it contained all the necessary documentation for the transport: court orders, foster care paperwork, medical records for the children. I flipped through the pages while keeping her in my peripheral vision. The documents looked official enough, complete with agency letterhead and case numbers and signatures from judges. But I'd seen enough forged paperwork in my career to notice the small inconsistencies. The fonts didn't quite match between pages. One signature was clearly photocopied and pasted digitally onto multiple documents. The case numbers followed a format that didn't align with how Colorado actually structured their child services files. When I pointed out these discrepancies, Denise's entire demeanor changed. The friendly foster mom persona evaporated, and she became defensive, angry even, demanding to know why I was harassing someone just trying to help children in need. She said I was going to make these kids late for their appointment, that there would be consequences, that I didn't understand how the system worked. My backup arrived within 10 minutes, another trooper named Vincent Reyes, who I'd worked with dozens of times. While he talked to Denise, keeping her away from the vehicle, I opened the van's sliding door to check on the children. The smell hit me immediately, this stale recycled air mixed with something chemical and sweet that I couldn't place. The girl in the back seat didn't react when I said hello. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. When I gently touched her shoulder, she made this small sound, not quite a word, more like a confused mumble. The 2 boys were in similar states, awake but not really conscious, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated when they tried to respond to my questions. I asked the girl what her name was, and she took almost 30 seconds to answer. Her words slurred like she was coming out of anesthesia. She said her name was Olivia, but she couldn't tell me her last name or where she was from or why she was in the van. The younger boy, who looked about 5, couldn't answer any questions at all. He just stared at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. I immediately called for an ambulance, telling dispatch we had 3 minors who appeared to be drugged, and requested a supervisor to respond to the scene. Denise started screaming then, actually screaming, about how we were destroying these children's lives, how their real parents were monsters, how she was protecting them from abuse. She kept shouting that we didn't understand, that the system was broken, that good people had to step in when the government failed. Vincent had to physically restrain her and put her in handcuffs because she tried to run back to the van. The whole time she was yelling names and details, saying Olivia's father had been reported for abuse 12 times, that the boy's mother was an addict, that someone had to save them. But when I asked her how she knew these children, how she'd gotten custody of them, where the actual court orders were, she went silent. Just stared at me with this disturbing conviction in her eyes, like she genuinely believed she was the hero in this situation. The ambulance arrived and paramedics loaded all 3 kids onto gurneys. Olivia was trying to stay awake but kept drifting off mid-sentence. The smallest boy had vomited on himself at some point and didn't even seem aware of it. The hospital in Lyman stabilized the children and ran blood work that came back showing dangerous levels of diphenhydramine in their systems, the active ingredient in sleep medication. The doctors said all 3 kids had been systematically drugged for at least 3 to 4 days based on the concentrations in their blood. They were severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showed signs of being restrained for extended periods. Olivia had ligature marks around her wrists that were several days old. When she finally became coherent enough to talk, around 6 hours after we'd brought her in, she told investigators that a woman had taken her from a playground near her school in Kansas 5 days earlier. The woman had told her that her mother sent her to pick Olivia up, that there was an emergency. Olivia said she'd been kept in a basement somewhere, that she'd been given medicine that made her sleep, that there were other people there talking about saving children. The 2 boys had similar stories, though the younger one was still too confused to give many details. Both had been taken from different locations in Kansas over the previous week. What came out during the investigation over the following weeks was somehow worse than a single kidnapping. Federal agents from the FBI got involved immediately because the children had been transported across state lines, and what they uncovered was a network of people operating through private social media groups who believed they were rescuing children from abusive situations. These weren't licensed foster agencies or legitimate child protection services. They were ordinary people, dozens of them scattered across multiple states, who'd convinced themselves that the legal system was failing children and that they needed to take matters into their own hands. They called themselves child advocates and freedom networkers, communicating through encrypted messaging apps and closed groups with names like Justice for Innocence and Safe Harbor Collective. Denise had been part of this network for almost 2 years, and her phone records showed hundreds of messages coordinating what they called extractions. They'd share information about families involved in custody disputes, parents who'd been reported to child services, any situation where they decided a child was in danger. Then they'd plan abductions, creating fake documentation, arranging temporary hiding places and eventually transport routes to move children to other members of the network in different states. The really disturbing part was how they justified everything. Agents found manifestos and shared documents in these groups where members talked about being warriors for children, about how traditional channels had failed, about their moral obligation to act. They'd screenshot news articles about child abuse cases, posts from parents venting about custody battles, anything they could twist into evidence that they needed to intervene. Olivia's father had never been charged with abuse. Those 12 reports Denise mentioned were actually a contentious divorce where Olivia's mother had filed complaints that were investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. But someone in the network had decided that meant the system was covering up abuse, and they'd targeted Olivia for extraction. The 2 boys had been taken from their grandmother's care while their mother completed a rehabilitation program. Their caseworker had regular contact with them, and they were scheduled to reunify with their mother within a month. But the network had seen a social media post about the mother's previous addiction and decided the children needed to be saved. They'd watched the grandmother's house, learned her routine, and taken the boys from her backyard while she was inside making lunch. Over 40 people were eventually arrested across 7 states as the investigation expanded. They found children being held in basements, spare bedrooms, even a converted garage where a couple in Arizona was keeping 2 siblings they'd taken from a shopping mall parking lot in New Mexico. Some of the children had been missing for months, their families desperate and destroyed, while their captors genuinely believed they were protecting them. The network had a system for creating false identities, forged documents that looked authentic enough to fool most people at a glance. They had members who worked in print shops, others with graphic design skills, people who'd figured out how to replicate official seals and signatures. Denise herself had been holding children at a property outside Grand Junction before transporting them to other network members. Investigators found a room in that house set up like a dormitory with 6 mattresses on the floor, bottles of sleep medication in the cabinet, and restraints hidden in a closet. She'd been moving kids through that location for over a year, and some of the children they recovered couldn't even remember their real names anymore because they'd been told they were someone else for so long. The thing that still gets to me, the part I can't shake even now, is how close Denise came to succeeding. If her registration tags hadn't been expired, if I'd been running radar somewhere else that morning, if I hadn't noticed the way those kids sat so unnaturally still, she would have made it to Denver. She had contacts there ready to take those 3 children and move them further into the network, maybe out of the country eventually. Olivia would have disappeared completely, and her parents would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their daughter. The 2 boys would have become ghosts. Their grandmother blamed herself until the day she died. All 3 kids had to go through months of therapy, and Olivia still has nightmares according to the victim advocate who stayed in touch with me. Denise Calabresi was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, and she never showed remorse. At her sentencing, she gave this speech about how history would vindicate her, how she'd done what was necessary, how the real criminals were the people who let children suffer. 47 other network members received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. The FBI shut down the online groups, but I know there are probably others out there, different names and different platforms, people who've convinced themselves that their twisted logic justifies stealing children. I think about that every single time I pull someone over now. Every traffic stop, every expired tag, every minor violation could be the thread that unravels something terrible. That silver minivan taught me that evil doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged woman in a purple fleece jacket, with an inspirational quote stitched on the chest, smiling at you through a car window while 3 drugged children sit silent in the back seat. People always ask me why I still drive during the day now, why I plan my routes to avoid stopping anywhere remote. The answer isn't simple, and honestly, most folks don't want to hear it. But I'll tell you anyway because what happened along Interstate 20 changed everything about how I see the road. April of 2015 marked my 12th year working highway patrol for the Alabama Department of Public Safety. My sergeant's exam was 2 weeks away, and I'd been pulling extra shifts to prove I could handle the responsibility. The stretch of I-20 between the Georgia line and Birmingham was my territory. 160 miles of asphalt I knew better than my own neighborhood. Rest areas were normally the quietest part of my shift, just truckers catching sleep and families letting kids burn off energy. That Tuesday morning in early April, everything looked routine when dispatch sent me to mile marker 165. The rest area sat about 40 miles east of Birmingham, one of those older facilities the state kept meaning to renovate but never got around to funding. Nothing fancy, just bathrooms, vending machines, and a few picnic tables under some pine trees. When I pulled in around 7 in the morning, the sun was already burning off the fog, and I counted maybe 4 vehicles in the lot. A silver Toyota Camry sat alone near the far end, away from the main building. The driver's door hung open. I remember thinking someone probably left it ajar by accident, maybe rushing to the bathroom. But as I got closer, I saw him slumped against the steering wheel, and there was blood on the window. A Glock 19 lay on the passenger seat. My training kicked in immediately, securing the scene, calling for backup and medical even though I could tell he was gone. The man's name was Jeffrey Pruitt, a sales manager from Atlanta heading home after a conference in Mississippi. 46 years old, married, 2 kids in college. The investigation lasted 3 days before they ruled it a suicide. I didn't think much about it after filing my report. Suicides happened on highways more than people realized, usually guys going through divorces or facing bankruptcy who couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The case file went to the county coroner, and I moved on to the next call. But 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday in late May, dispatch sent me to mile marker 142, same highway, different rest area. This one was smaller, just a parking lot with bathrooms and a pet walking area. A white Ford F-150 sat by itself near the tree line. The driver was a woman named Angela Cortez, a nursing supervisor from Louisiana, driving to visit her sister in Atlanta. 51 years old, recently promoted at work, no history of depression according to her family. She'd been shot once in the right temple with a Smith & Wesson revolver that belonged to her late father. The weapon was still in her right hand when the cleaning crew found her that morning. Again, investigators called it suicide, and again, something about it bothered me, but I couldn't articulate what. The third one happened in early July, mile marker 188, a rest area on the other side of Birmingham that technically wasn't even my usual patrol zone. I only heard about it because the trooper who responded, a guy named Calvin I'd gone through the academy with, mentioned it during a shift change. Another apparent suicide, another isolated rest area, another victim with no obvious motive. This time it was a man named Howard Chen, a restaurant owner from Texas driving to a food service convention in Georgia. 63 years old, grandfather of 5, pillars of his community back in Houston. He'd supposedly shot himself with a Ruger that investigators found wiped clean of prints except for his own. Calvin said the scene felt staged to him, too neat, too convenient. But physical evidence supported suicide, and without proof of foul play, the case closed within a week. I started keeping my own notes after that conversation, writing down dates and locations in a notebook I kept in my patrol car. By mid-August, 2 more bodies turned up at rest areas along I-20, both ruled suicides within days of discovery. The pattern became impossible to ignore. All 5 deaths occurred between 6 and 8 in the morning, always at older, less traveled facilities, always single gunshot wounds to the head, always with the victim's own registered firearm. The geographical spread covered nearly 200 miles of interstate, but something connected them beyond coincidence. I brought my concerns to Sergeant Daniels during our weekly briefing, laying out the timeline and locations on a map I'd marked up with red circles. He listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When I finished, he pointed out that 5 suicides over 4 months across multiple counties didn't constitute a pattern worth investigating, especially when every scene supported the official conclusion. He told me to focus on my regular duties and stop wasting time on closed cases, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I requested copies of all 5 incident reports through official channels, claiming I needed them for a training presentation on suicide prevention. The reports arrived 3 days later, and I spent an entire weekend going through every detail with a highlighter and notepad. The ballistics information caught my attention first. In 3 of the 5 cases, the forensic reports noted unusual stippling patterns around the entrance wounds, inconsistent with self-inflicted injuries at close range. The powder burn suggested the barrel had been held at a slightly different angle than what you'd expect from someone shooting themselves. It was subtle enough that individual investigators missed it, but when you compared all 5 reports side by side, the similarity became obvious. Then I noticed the timing. Every single death occurred within a 90-minute window, between 6:15 and 7:45 in the morning, when rest areas typically had minimal traffic. Security cameras at these facilities were either broken or positioned to cover only the bathroom entrances, not the parking areas. Whoever was doing this understood rest area layouts and surveillance limitations better than most law enforcement officers would. I started reviewing highway camera footage next, submitting requests through the Department of Transportation database. Most agencies don't realize how much footage gets archived, especially on major interstates where traffic monitoring runs constantly. I focused on the hours preceding each death, looking for vehicles that appeared near multiple scenes. The work took weeks because I could only access the system during my shifts without raising suspicion. In late September, I found what I'd been searching for: a dark blue Dodge Ram pickup, extended cab, no visible plates in most frames, appeared on camera footage within 2 hours of 4 different rest area deaths. The truck always traveled eastbound, always during early morning hours, and always exited the interstate at the ramp just past each facility. I traced its movements backward and discovered it entered the highway from different on-ramps each time, never establishing a predictable pattern. But there was something else, something that made my chest tighten when I spotted it. The truck had a light bar mounted across the roof, the kind volunteer firefighters or security contractors use, perfectly legal to own, but illegal to activate on public roads, unless you're emergency personnel. I made copies of every frame showing that truck, burned them to a disk, and locked it in my personal locker at the station. The next morning, I drove to the Alabama Bureau of Investigation field office in Birmingham and asked to speak with whoever handled serial crime cases. They assigned me to an investigator named Special Agent Fitzgerald, a woman in her early 50s who'd worked organized crime before transferring to major case investigations. I laid everything out for her, the timeline, the ballistics inconsistencies, the truck, the footage, all of it. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook that looked older than I was. When I finished, she asked me one question. Did anyone else know about my investigation? I told her no, that my sergeant had dismissed my concerns, and I'd been working alone. Fitzgerald nodded slowly, then made a phone call right there in front of me. 20 minutes later, 2 more agents joined us in the conference room, and suddenly my informal inquiry became an official investigation. The Bureau moved fast once they had the footage and ballistics comparisons. Within 72 hours, they'd identified the truck through partial VIN reconstruction from enhanced camera images and cross-referenced it with vehicle registration databases across 6 states. The owner was a man named Glenn Whitaker, 57 years old, former sheriff's deputy from Mississippi, who'd been terminated in 2013 after multiple excessive force complaints. He'd sued the department for wrongful termination, lost, and basically disappeared from law enforcement circles. Property records showed he owned a small house outside Meridian, but neighbors reported seeing him only sporadically. His bank records revealed he'd been making cash deposits every few weeks, amounts that suggested he was working somewhere, but not reporting income. The Bureau also discovered he still had access to decommissioned badges and equipment through a friend who ran a police surplus store. Fitzgerald told me they believed Whitaker was conducting fake traffic stops at rest areas, using his lights and credentials to approach victims who thought they were dealing with legitimate law enforcement. The theory was that he'd target people traveling alone, wait for them to park at isolated rest areas, then approach with his badge and some fabricated violation. Once he had them out of their vehicles or vulnerable inside them, he'd force them to use their own weapons, staging the scenes to look like suicides. The ballistics inconsistencies came from him controlling the gun while making it appear self-inflicted, a technique that required knowledge of forensic investigation procedures. It was methodical, calculated, and absolutely terrifying, because it exploited the one thing most people trust without question on the highway. The Bureau wanted to set up surveillance on Whitaker's property and monitor the interstate for his truck, but Fitzgerald had a different idea. She asked if I'd be willing to work undercover as bait, driving my personal vehicle along I-20 during early morning hours to draw him out. The plan was risky, but federal agents would be tracking me constantly through GPS, and backup units would stay within 3 minutes of my location at all times. I agreed to do it, partly because I wanted this guy caught, and partly because I knew those 5 victims deserved justice their families weren't getting. For 2 weeks in November, I drove my personal Subaru Outback along I-20 during the early morning shift, stopping at different rest areas between the Georgia line and Birmingham. The Bureau had fitted my vehicle with hidden cameras and audio equipment, plus a panic button disguised as my key fob. Every morning felt like walking a tightrope because I had to appear vulnerable enough to attract attention, but alert enough to react if things went wrong. On the 14th day, a Friday morning in mid-November, I pulled into the rest area at mile marker 151 around 6:30. The parking lot was empty except for one semi-truck at the far end, driver probably sleeping in the cab. I parked near the picnic area, killed the engine, and pretended to check my phone. 15 minutes passed, then I saw it in my rearview mirror. That dark blue Dodge Ram rolling slowly into the lot, light bar clearly visible on the roof. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay calm, to act natural. The truck parked 2 spaces behind me, angled so its headlights illuminated my vehicle. A man got out wearing what looked like a deputy's uniform, complete with badge and utility belt. He approached my driver's side window with that specific walk law enforcement develops, authoritative but not aggressive. When he knocked on my glass, I rolled it down and tried to look confused rather than terrified. He introduced himself as Deputy Whitaker, said he'd received a report about a vehicle matching mine, involved in a hit-and-run back at mile marker 165, needed to see my license and registration. His voice was calm, professional, exactly how a real officer would sound. I handed him my documents, buying time for the backup units to close in. He examined them for maybe 30 seconds, then handed them back and asked me to step out of the vehicle. That's when I saw his right hand drift toward his belt, not to his radio or citation book, but to a holster that held a Beretta 9mm. I pressed the panic button. Everything happened in less than 90 seconds. 4 unmarked bureau vehicles came screaming into the rest area from both directions, blocking every exit. Whitaker realized what was happening immediately, his expression shifting from professional calm to pure rage in an instant. He went for his weapon, but agents were already out of their cars, weapons drawn, shouting commands. He put his hands up slowly, that fake badge glinting in the morning sun. They took him down hard on the pavement, cuffed him, and searched his truck on sight. Inside, they found a collection of decommissioned badges from 3 different agencies, 2 sets of magnetic emergency lights, a police radio scanner, and a laptop containing surveillance photos of at least 15 different rest areas along I-20 and Interstate 59. They also found a notebook with dates, times, and vehicle descriptions, including entries that matched all 5 victims. In the glove compartment was a Taurus pistol that ballistics later matched to gunshot residue found at 2 of the crime scenes, residue that shouldn't have existed if the deaths were truly suicides. Whitaker's trial lasted 6 weeks in federal court. Prosecutors charged him with 5 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful impersonation of law enforcement, and a dozen other felonies. The evidence was overwhelming, from the ballistics matches to the surveillance footage to the materials in his truck. His defense tried to argue that he'd been conducting citizen patrols and had nothing to do with the deaths, but the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting him on all counts. He got 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The families of the victims finally got answers, though I know that knowledge probably didn't ease their pain much. As for me, I made sergeant 6 months later, but I never stopped thinking about those 2 weeks in November, about how close I came to becoming the 6th victim in his notebook. These days, I coordinate rest area safety initiatives for the state, making sure cameras cover parking lots and increasing patrol presence during early morning hours. People still ask why I'm so obsessive about it, why I push for funding nobody else thinks is necessary. I just tell them I've seen what happens when we're not watching carefully enough, when someone exploits the trust people place in a badge and a uniform. That's usually enough to end the conversation, because deep down, nobody really wants to think about the fact that the person pulling you over might not be who they claim to be. "15 years on the force, and I thought I'd seen everything." That's what I kept telling myself during those endless overnight shifts patrolling the stretch of Highway 89 between Flagstaff and the Nevada border. My sergeant used to joke that nothing exciting ever happened on a Wednesday night in November, and for the most part, he was right. I'd spent the better part of 2013 writing speeding tickets and helping stranded motorists with flat tires. My daughter had just turned 6 that fall, and I'd been pulling extra shifts to save up for her birthday trip to Disneyland the following summer. The job had become routine, comfortable even, which is probably why I almost dismissed the alert when it came through on my automated license plate reader around 2 in the morning. The system pinged with that sharp electronic beep that always made my coffee jump in the cup holder. A silver 2007 Ford Taurus had just passed my position, heading westbound. The plate came back registered to a vehicle connected to a missing persons investigation out of Indiana. Not a warrant, not a stolen vehicle report, just a flag in the system asking officers to make contact and report. I'd gotten maybe 3 or 4 of these alerts in my entire career, and they usually turned out to be clerical errors or family members who'd taken off voluntarily, and someone filed a report anyway. Still, protocol was protocol. I flipped on my lights and pulled out onto the highway, watching the Taurus's brake lights flare red in the darkness ahead. The car didn't speed up or try to run. It just drifted smoothly onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and came to a complete stop with the turn signal still blinking. That should have been my first hint that something was seriously wrong, because normal people panic a little when they see those lights. This driver had been expecting it. I approached the vehicle with my flashlight, doing the standard scan of the interior through the back window before I got to the driver's side. What I saw made me stop mid-step. The back seat was completely gutted. No upholstery, no fabric, just bare metal framework and springs exposed like the skeleton of some animal. Every window, front and back, had this reflective silver material taped to the inside, the kind of emergency blanket stuff you see in survival kits. It caught my flashlight beam and threw it back at me in fragmented patterns. Through the gaps in the material, I could make out shapes in the back, duffel bags maybe, and something that looked like chains bundled up on the floor. My hand went to my radio instinctively, but I didn't call it in yet. Sometimes people lived out of their cars, and maybe this guy was just some eccentric traveler with weird modifications. That's what I tried to tell myself as I reached the driver's window and tapped on the glass with my knuckles. The window rolled down, and the smell hit me first. Not the usual car odors of fast food or air freshener, but something chemical and sharp, like industrial cleaner mixed with sweat. The driver was a white male, maybe in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his face that made my pulse pick up. Deep purple bruises spread across his left cheek and temple, fresh enough that the edges were still that ugly yellow-green color. His right eye was bloodshot, the white turned completely red like a blood vessel had burst. More bruises ringed his neck, finger-shaped marks that looked like someone had tried to strangle him. He wore a stained gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up, revealing more bruising on his forearms, defensive wounds crisscrossing his skin. Despite all this, he smiled at me. Not nervous, not guilty, just tired. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice hoarse and raspy. "I figured you'd pull me over sooner or later." I asked for his license and registration, keeping my voice steady even though every instinct was screaming at me to call for backup right then. He handed them over without hesitation. Movements slow and deliberate, like he didn't want to spook me. The license read Gregory Allen Brenner, address in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Same state as the missing persons flag. I shined my light past him into the passenger seat and saw a clipboard with what looked like printed photographs paper-clipped to forms. The kind of documentation you'd see in official paperwork. "Mr. Brenner," I said, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them." He nodded, that same exhausted compliance, and opened his door. When he stood up, I noticed he was limping, favoring his left leg. He positioned himself against the side of the car without me having to tell him, hands flat on the roof like he'd done this before. While I patted him down, I asked about the bruises. He didn't flinch when I touched his ribs, even though I could feel the swelling through his hoodie. "Got into it with a runner 2 days ago in Pennsylvania," he said, matter of fact. Kid was stronger than he looked. 17 years old and built like a linebacker. Had to use pepper spray to get him secured. Runner. That word hung in the air between us. I stepped back and told him to turn around slowly. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Brenner?" He met my eyes, and there was nothing deceptive in his expression, just bone-deep weariness. "I recover runaway teenagers for their families," he said. "Private contracts, mostly through a service based out of Ohio. Parents hire the company when their kids take off and the police can't help fast enough. I locate them, make contact, and transport them back home. It's legal work, officer. I have all the documentation in the car. Signed parental consent forms, photographs, last known locations, everything." That's when I called for backup. Something about the way he said it, so rehearsed and clinical, made my gut twist. While we waited for my partner to arrive, I asked Brenner about the modifications to his vehicle. He explained each one like he was describing features on a work truck. The stripped back seat made it easier to clean and disinfect between transports. The reflective material on the windows prevented runners from signaling to people outside or breaking the glass to escape. The reinforced trunk, he claimed, was for secure storage of personal belongings so the teenagers couldn't access anything dangerous during transport. They get violent sometimes, he added, touching the bruise on his face, especially the ones who've been on the street for months. They don't understand I'm trying to help them get home. My partner, Officer Janet Kurtz, arrived within 10 minutes and immediately radioed for a supervisor when she saw the state of the vehicle. Brenner remained calm throughout, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, watching us with that tired, patient expression. We searched the car with Brenner's permission, and what we found made the situation exponentially worse. In the trunk, underneath a heavy wool blanket, we discovered a metal toolbox containing zip ties, duct tape, a taser, two-way radios, and a locked leather pouch that Brenner said held medical sedatives. For extreme cases, he explained when Kurtz held up the pouch, when they're a danger to themselves or others during transport, I have a standing prescription from a doctor who works with the company. The clipboard from the front seat contained files on 6 different teenagers, each with a professional photograph, physical descriptions, known associates, and locations where they'd been spotted. 3 of the files had red stamps across them reading, "Recovered." The other 3 were still active. One of them, a 16-year-old girl named Cassidy from South Bend, had a note scrawled in the margin. Last seen Sunday near truck stop, Reno area. Confirmed sighting, proceed with caution, has knife. The photograph showed a blonde teenager with a nose piercing and scared eyes. My supervisor, Sergeant Dalton, arrived with 2 more units and immediately separated Brenner from us to conduct his own interview. While that happened, Kurtz and I started making calls. The company Brenner mentioned, Homeward Solutions LLC, existed and had a website advertising family reunification services. But when we contacted the Ohio Attorney General's office, things started unraveling fast. They had no record of any legitimate bail enforcement or recovery agency operating under that name. The business license had been registered just 8 months prior using a P.O. box address. When we ran Brenner's background, we found 2 prior arrests in Illinois for unlawful restraint that had been pleaded down to misdemeanors. He'd also been fired from a bail bonds company in 2009 for using excessive force on a skip. None of this matched his story of being a professional family service contractor. The parental consent forms in his files looked official enough, but the signatures were all variations of the same handwriting style, and none of the phone numbers listed for the parents connected to working lines. What really broke the case open was the missing persons database. When we cross-referenced the names and photos from Brenner's files, 4 of the 6 teenagers were listed as endangered runaways with active investigations. But here's the thing that still makes my skin prickle when I think about it. None of the families in those reports had ever hired anyone to find their kids. In fact, 2 of the families specifically told investigators they'd been contacted by someone claiming to have information about their children's whereabouts in exchange for payment. One mother in Wisconsin had wired $3,000 to Homeward Solutions before losing contact with them entirely. The girl in that file, 14-year-old Bethany, had been missing for 7 weeks when we pulled Brenner over. We found her jacket in his trunk, along with a prepaid cell phone containing text messages discussing pickup locations and delivery fees. The messages referenced other drivers, other vehicles, and what they called collection zones in truck stops and bus stations across 5 different states. Brenner was arrested on the spot and charged with kidnapping, extortion, and interstate transportation of minors. He didn't resist, didn't lawyer up immediately, just kept insisting he was doing honest work for desperate families. During processing, he gave up names of 3 other drivers working the same circuit, along with the identity of the man running the operation, a former private investigator named Carl Novak, who'd been operating out of a storage unit in Dayton. The FBI got involved within hours because of the multi-state nature of the crimes. What they uncovered was worse than any of us anticipated. Novak had been running this scheme for at least 2 years, targeting vulnerable runaways who'd already been reported missing. His drivers would locate these kids at shelters, street corners, anywhere they congregated, then either lure them with promises of help or simply grab them when the opportunity presented itself. Some were held in the modified vehicles for days while Novak contacted families pretending to be a legitimate recovery service. If families paid, the kids would sometimes actually be returned, traumatized, but alive. If families couldn't pay or refused, the teenagers would be abandoned in random locations far from where they'd been taken, or worse, sold to other criminal networks Novak had connections with. The case took 8 months to fully investigate and prosecute. They recovered 11 teenagers in total, including Cassidy, who was found at a motel outside Reno 3 days after we arrested Brenner. She'd been locked in his trunk for 6 hours during a transport before he stopped for the night and moved her to a room he'd paid for in cash. Bethany was found safe with relatives in Florida, placed there by another one of Novak's drivers who apparently had some remaining conscience, and dropped her somewhere she'd be cared for instead of following orders. Brenner got 18 years federal prison. Novak got 35. The other drivers received sentences ranging from 8 to 22 years depending on their level of involvement. I testified at 3 separate trials, and every time I had to look at those files again, at those scared faces in the photographs, I felt sick. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violence or the cruelty of it all. It's how mundane Brenner made it sound that night on the highway. How he genuinely seemed to believe he was providing a service. That's what evil looks like sometimes. Not some monster in the shadows. Just an exhausted man in a stained hoodie who's convinced himself that what he's doing is justified. I still patrol that same stretch of highway, but I don't dismiss those automated alerts anymore, no matter how routine they seem. I'd been doing highway maintenance work for nearly 8 years, mostly night shifts when that case hit the news. Back then, I was covering long overnight drives between small towns, usually alone, checking cameras and road barriers. That stretch of road had always been quiet. Long flat miles, distant lights from gas stations, and the occasional convoy of trucks humming in the dark. My life revolved around coffee from vending machines, static from the radio, and the comfort of routine. It was the kind of monotony that made you start noticing every detail. How the fog hung low over the fields, how the asphalt changed tone under different kinds of headlights. The night it happened, I wasn't far. About 10 minutes before the report came in, I was parked near an emergency pull-off, logging some barrier replacements on my tablet. Out of habit, I kept the radio on the local patrol frequency. When dispatch called in a sedan crash near one of the overpasses, the tone in their voice made me sit up. They mentioned the driver was unresponsive, and something about impact from above. My first thought was that maybe a trucker had dropped cargo, but that explanation didn't last long once I heard they'd closed the entire span of the bridge. I drove out there before they even asked for road crew assistance. The scene looked wrong in that cold fluorescent glare. Cones scattered, paramedics crouched by a car that had veered halfway into the grass. The windshield was shattered inward, glass sparkling like frost under the lights. A patrol officer I knew, Carter, waved me back when I got too close. He just shook his head when I asked if the driver was okay. I remember noticing the dent on the hood. It wasn't from a collision with another car. It was small and deep, as if someone had dropped a cinder block from above. Later that morning, when the footage started circulating between departments, curiosity got the better of me. The dash cam from that sedan showed exactly what they said. A dark shape falling from the bridge just before the impact. No one visible on the structure. Nothing showing where it came from. But the next day, another call came in. Different highway, same pattern. And by the third, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone, or several someones, was targeting random cars for some kind of twisted online stunt. When the task force got involved, I was asked to assist with inspecting the bridges along my route. I'd seen a lot of strange things on those night shifts. Accidents, wildlife, even the occasional person wandering along the shoulder. But this felt different. The officers were tense, quiet, and always looking up. Each bridge we checked carried that same uneasy silence, like the air itself remembered what had happened there. On one overpass, I found a small pile of gravel stacked neatly near the edge, like someone had been preparing ammunition. It was the kind of detail you'd overlook if you weren't paying attention. Word spread fast in nearby towns. People started avoiding the highway after dark, and the local news ran every segment they could. Some treated it like gossip, others like a ghost story. Then came the videos. Short clips surfacing online of masked kids throwing debris and laughing as headlights swerved below. Most were fake or re-uploaded pranks, but a few matched the timing and locations of the real incidents. That's when it stopped feeling like an isolated crime, and more like something coordinated, maybe even celebrated. One night, I was called out again. Another report near a bridge about 15 miles from the first crash. By the time I arrived, the suspect was already in custody. He couldn't have been more than 17. What I'll never forget is the look on the officer's face standing next to him. Carter, the same guy from the first scene. He kept his eyes on the ground as the kid was loaded into the patrol car. Only later did I learn that boy was his son. It explained the silence that hung over the investigation afterward, the way everyone avoided mentioning names. A week later, when the reports were filed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The attacks had been planned over a private group chat, a challenge that promised viral fame to whoever caused the biggest wreck. Every clip, every timestamp, every shared laugh, it was all there. Carter went on leave not long after, and that stretch of highway was fitted with new cameras and metal nets under the bridges. Still, even now, when I drive those roads at night, I catch myself scanning the overpasses out of habit. Sometimes I swear I see movement up there, just a flicker, like someone leaning over the railing, waiting. A few months passed, and the highway slowly returned to normal traffic. The memorial cross for the first victim stayed on the shoulder, surrounded by faded flowers and empty bottles left by strangers. I'd drive past it during my shifts, always slowing down a little. It became a quiet reminder of how quickly something senseless could change everything. The investigation wrapped up without much media coverage after that. Most people just moved on. But for those of us who worked those nights, the silence never really went away. One evening, during a storm, I had to inspect one of the bridges we'd reinforced. Rain was hammering so hard it blurred the guardrails into streaks of gray. When I stepped out of the truck, I saw something sitting near the edge. A chunk of concrete about the size of a football, resting perfectly in the center of the walkway. It looked fresh, like it had been placed there minutes earlier. There were no footprints, no tire marks on the shoulder. Just the sound of rain and the echo of water dripping through the cracks. I radioed it in, and they sent a unit to sweep the area. Nothing came of it, of course. The footage showed no one approaching the bridge for hours before I got there. Still, for weeks afterward, the spotlights under that overpass stayed on every night, cutting through the dark like warning eyes. Drivers probably thought it was just another safety measure. I knew better. It was there because some part of us couldn't trust that it was truly over. I left that job a year later and took a position closer to home. But I still drive those same roads sometimes out of habit, watching the lights of the bridges fade in the distance. Every now and then, I think about Carter's kid and the twisted chain of dares that started it all. The internet forgot, like it always does, but I can't. Whenever a gust of wind rattles my windshield, I glance up at the overpasses without even realizing it. You'd think after all this time I'd stop expecting to see someone up there, but I never do. Not clearly, anyway. When I joined the patrol, I used to love the early morning shifts, the kind of quiet stretches where the fog hung low, and the only sounds were my own tires rolling over wet asphalt. That night, I was halfway through my shift when dispatch came through with a call that didn't sound right. A woman's voice, shaky and muffled, claiming she was on the shoulder and that someone had tried to take her. The connection kept cutting out, just fragments of sentences and the soft sound of her breathing. like she was trying not to be heard. The dispatcher flagged it as high priority because the area had poor reception and no backup nearby. I was the closest unit, about 15 minutes out, and the kind of silence that followed the last transmission made the hair on my arms rise. I remember driving through the fog and feeling how the world seemed smaller, swallowed up by that pale gray. Visibility was maybe 30 feet at best. My cruiser headlights barely cut through, turning the mist into a glowing wall ahead of me. I slowed near the marker where the call had pinged, rolling the window down to listen. Nothing but the hum of the engine and the faraway hiss of traffic. Then faintly, movement. A shape walking along the shoulder, drenched, shivering, her hands held close to her chest like she was trying to warm herself. I pulled over, hit the lights, and stepped out, calling to her. She looked up at me, face pale, strands of wet hair plastered to her forehead. Her voice came out in bursts, between shallow breaths. She said she'd been kidnapped, managed to get away when her abductor pulled off onto a side road, and that his vehicle was still there. She kept pointing toward the tree line where the fog thickened like smoke. I noted her condition, soaked, trembling, barefoot, wearing a torn dress that clung to her. No ID, no bag. My training kicked in. Keep distance, stay alert, get details. I radioed dispatch, but all I got was static, a scratchy half-response that dissolved into noise. She urged me to follow her, said the man was probably still there, maybe hurt. The urgency in her eyes made me hesitate. Something about her kept shifting, not physically, but in the way she looked at me. 1 second desperate, the next oddly calm. I tried my radio again, switched channels, and caught fragments of something else, a voice repeating phrases almost identical to what she'd said a minute ago. "Please help me. He's still there." The same tone, the same pauses, like a recording playing just out of sync. My stomach tightened. I drew a breath, glanced back at the highway, still empty, and decided to follow her a few steps off the shoulder, my hand resting on my flashlight. The turnoff she led me to was barely visible through the fog, just a narrow path of gravel curving between overgrown brush. My boots sank into the soft mud as I stepped past the guardrail. The air smelled metallic, like rain and old engine oil. She kept glancing over her shoulder, whispering that the car was right there, but every time I looked where she pointed, there was nothing but mist. Then something flickered in my peripheral vision. A red glint, maybe a taillight gone as quickly as it appeared. I angled my flashlight, catching the outline of a scarf tangled on a low branch. It looked new but damp, like someone had deliberately set it there. I called out, asking for her name, trying to ground the situation, but she didn't answer. When I turned around, she was standing farther away than before, near the bend where the gravel disappeared into darkness. The fog swallowed her figure up to the waist, her outline blurred like a smudge on glass. I stepped closer, but before I could say anything, my radio cracked to life. A burst of feedback, then a familiar voice. Mine. My own voice, repeating the words I'd said minutes earlier when I'd first arrived. The same tone, the same background noise. It didn't make sense. I froze in place, listening as the static warped back into silence. I switched frequencies, trying to reach dispatch again, and got a different transmission. Faint crying, distant and repetitive, like someone replaying a short clip on a loop. It wasn't coming from my radio anymore. It was coming from somewhere nearby. A muffled echo drifting through the fog. My flashlight caught a glimmer of something small on the ground. A child's sneaker, perfectly clean, as if it had never touched mud. The placement was too deliberate. It felt staged, like pieces being laid out to guide me deeper in. I scanned the area, scanning the fog for movement, and realized how quiet it had become. No wind, no insects, no highway noise. Just me. Instinct told me to pull back, regroup, call for backup from a safer distance. But then my phone buzzed with a map notification, the shared location from the emergency call. I glanced at it, and the pin was moving, jumping erratically between 2 points. One near my cruiser, the other farther down the turnoff. It kept switching back and forth, as if someone wanted me to chase it. I turned toward the direction of the second point, and that's when I saw it. A faint silhouette crouched behind a cluster of bushes, Not moving, not running, just waiting, watching me through the fog. I kept the beam steady, scanning the shape ahead. The crouched figure didn't move, not even when I called out. My thumb hovered near the safety clip on my holster, every nerve on alert. I took one cautious step forward. That was when a faint metallic tap echoed behind me. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, catching the edge of something reflective near my cruiser's lights in the distance. The instant I looked back, the silhouette was gone. I couldn't see where it went, but the fog shifted slightly, like air displaced by movement. My pulse thudded in my ears and I realized I'd lost sight of the woman entirely. My training told me to return to the vehicle, but curiosity and protocol fought inside me. What if someone really was hurt out there? I moved a few steps deeper down the turnoff. A dim glow appeared through the mist, headlights angled downward, half buried in brush. The car was there after all. The driver's door was open, the interior lights flickering weakly. I announced myself, cleared the immediate area, then leaned in to look. The seats were empty, but the floor was littered with small objects, coins, a hair tie, an empty water bottle, all too clean, too carefully scattered. A faint smell of gasoline hung in the air. Then from my radio again came a voice I recognized, my dispatcher, but it was wrong. The timing of her speech was off, each word clipped and mechanical. Unit 3-1, confirm status. I answered, but the line crackled and her voice continued repeating the same sentence, even as I spoke. Layered under it was another faint sound, whispers, too low to distinguish, moving in and out of the static. It felt like multiple transmissions stitched together. My instincts screamed that I was being baited, pulled deeper into something orchestrated. I backed away from the car, scanning the tree line again. As I reached for my flashlight belt, my boot hit something. A folded paper map, half buried in the mud. It wasn't weathered like you'd expect. When I picked it up, I saw a red circle drawn around the very area I was standing in. The ink hadn't run from the rain. My location, marked ahead of time. Every small detail, the scarf, the sneaker, even the scattered items in the car, started connecting in my head. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this down to the minute. The fog seemed heavier now, pressing close, and somewhere out there, just past where I could see, a low engine turned over. The sound of that engine cut straight through the fog. A low rumble that idled for a moment, then stopped. I turned my light in the direction it came from, but there was nothing but a wall of mist. My cruiser's lights were barely visible through the haze behind me. I decided to move back toward the highway, keeping my flashlight low and my hand close to my sidearm. Each step on the gravel felt loud, like I was announcing my location. Halfway back, I caught another flicker of movement, someone darting between the trees to my left, too fast to track. I shouted a warning, identified myself as law enforcement, but the woods answered with silence. When I finally reached the edge of the shoulder, I saw a second pair of headlights through the fog. Backup. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, until I noticed they were angled wrong. Not approaching from the interstate, but already parked there facing mine. A black SUV, engine running, no markings. Its driver's door was ajar, interior dark. I called out again, voice firm, but got no response. The wind shifted then and I could smell something, the same gasoline scent, stronger this time. That's when the dispatcher's voice returned, crystal clear, saying my unit number, but this time she used my first name. Only she didn't know my first name. I cut the radio immediately, stepped behind my cruiser for cover and drew my weapon. The SUV headlights dimmed slightly, like someone had just stepped in front of them. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of my engine cooling down. Then came the faint scrape of shoes on asphalt. One figure, maybe two, walking slowly along the shoulder toward me. I shouted commands. No reply. My light caught only fragments, the glint of wet fabric, a hand partially raised, a shadow moving just out of focus. And then the sound stopped. The SUV engine cut. Silence again, heavy enough that I could hear my heartbeat. Later, investigators said I was lucky. Another unit found me about 20 minutes after my last transmission, standing by my cruiser, weapon drawn, still sweeping the fog. The SUV was gone. So was the woman. The only evidence left were footprints, several sets, circling my patrol car before vanishing into the brush. The victim's phone, the one used to make the call, was later found 2 counties away, wiped clean except for one saved audio clip. My own voice distorted and replaying the same few words I'd spoken when I first arrived. Whoever they were, they knew exactly how to lure an officer alone into the dark.